Hi, everyone. It's me, Fran Drescher, your SAG-AFTRA National President. And I just wanted to thank you all for coming to this informational in-person meeting. It's so important that you fully understand the breadth and width of this contract so that you can make an informed decision when it comes to the ratification process. It is a very big and complex contract that services many, many different career paths in our union. And so if you have questions, now is the time to ask them. If you go to sagaftra.org/contracts 2023, you will see a lot of information there that might be helpful for you, including frequently asked questions. I'm just so happy that you're here. I'm so proud of your interest in this. We want to satisfy all of your concerns and all of your questions. We worked very hard. We're very proud, and I'm proud of you as well. So let's get on with understanding the contract and asking the questions meaningful to you so that you can go ahead and vote by December 5th at 5 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you so much, and take it away, Duncan.
Awesome. Thanks for that message, Fran. And do want to just say thank you and hello to all of the members who have joined us for this webinar. My name is Duncan Crabtree-Ireland. As I think Pam or Fran mentioned, I'm the National Executive Director and Chief Negotiator of SAG-AFTRA, and we're going to go through a presentation in just a few moments that will give you all of the overview of the contract and its details, and then we'll have plenty of time to answer questions as well after that. I do want to just start out, though, by saying a huge thank you to all of our members who participated in this process from the very beginning, from when we launched the W&W meetings back in December of last year, throughout the lead up to negotiations, throughout the negotiations themselves, and of course, the strike. President Drescher, who chaired our negotiating committee, and our negotiating committee, so committed, so hardworking, so smart. It was a real honor to work with them. And of course, our members who showed up to picket lines, to rallies, went out on social media, did everything to help increase our leverage in this negotiation. And especially our strike captains who kept the picket lines going every day, day in and day out throughout the 118 days of this strike. So huge thank you to all of you, and acknowledgement that your unity and your solidarity is what gave us the power to achieve the agreement that we're going to be talking about. I want to also just note that our Chief Contracts Officer and my co-lead negotiator for this agreement, Ray Rodriguez, is going to also be part of doing this presentation and doing our Q&A as well. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get started with the slide deck. And we are, of course, talking about the 2023 TV Theatrical Tentative Agreement. And we'll start out by talking about the valuation of this agreement. So as you can see on the slide here, this contract is valued at more than $1 billion in new compensation and increases to benefit plan funding. That's comprised of $697.6 million in additional wages and residuals, and $317.2 million in the form of contributions, additional contributions into the SAG-AFTRA Health Plan, SAG Producers Pension Plan, and the After Retirement Fund. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. On our next slide, we talk about minimums. That's another really important piece of this contract. And I'm very, very happy to say that we were able to break the so-called industry pattern. And this is something that hasn't been done in decades of bargaining by any of the unions in this industry. The historic pattern has been that the first negotiation sets the increases in minimums and everyone else just has to agree to those. But we came into this negotiation saying, we don't agree to that philosophy. We're not going to accept that. And with the help of all of the leverage created by your commitment to fighting on the picket lines, et cetera, we were able to break that pattern. And so in the first year of this contract, there will be a two-step wage increase, two increases within the first year. Immediately, actually, as of the 9th of November, there's a 7% general wage increase. And then effective next July 1st, there'll be an additional 4% general wage increase for a compounded first-year increase of 11.28% in minimums. And then on July 1st of the following year in 2025, there'll be an additional 3.5% increase in minimums. If we continue on, we know that one of the hot topics in this conversation is the question of artificial intelligence, AI. So we're just going to launch into a discussion of that right at the beginning of the presentation. So this contract contains, for the first time, comprehensive rules about informed consent and fair compensation for AI. And that's what we said we were going to achieve at the beginning of the process, and we were able to achieve that. Now, that doesn't mean that this contract is perfect. It doesn't mean that we have everything that we want with regard to AI, but we fought hard with your support throughout the entire duration of this negotiation and the strike process. AI was on the table in our very first proposal on June 7th, and AI was the very last thing agreed to in this negotiation on day 118 of the strike. What we have in this agreement addresses informed consent and fair compensation, especially as it relates to what is happening now and what we expect to happen in the immediate future in this contract, which is digital replication of actors. We've already seen it happen with certain performers, and we expect that there will be an increase in the use of digital replication during the term of this contract. So the first sort of group of rules that are in this contract about AI include the scenario where an employer is going to create a digital replica of you as part of your engagement on a project. So you're hired for a project, and then they create a digital replica of you in addition to your engagement there. That's called an employment-based digital replica because they're hiring you and you're going to get paid for the time that it takes to create the digital replica as work time, and then you're going to be paid for any use of that digital replica in addition to, of course, your compensation for your normal in-person work time. So first of all, this contract ends the practice of surprise scanning or last-minute decisions to scan, because there's a requirement for 48 hours notice before you can be expected to participate in any kind of creation of a digital replica. And there also is a requirement for a clear and conspicuous consent to the creation or use of a digital replica in the contract. And that is informed consent. It's not just a boilerplate line buried in a contract somewhere. It has to be both clear and conspicuous, and the consent has to include specific details, reasonably specific details about the intended use of the digital replica, so you can decide whether that's something you want to allow or not allow. Any time that you spend, as I mentioned, in the creation of the digital replica, like, for example, time spent scanning, is work time and is paid for. And then any kind of use of that digital replica triggers a minimum compensation that's based on the time it would have taken you to do that work if it were done in person. And that compensation, of course, is plus P&H and residuals. And that's a minimum. You can certainly negotiate up for that, just like other terms in our contract. And so that assures you that you won't be paid less than that. And if you have the leverage and want to, you can negotiate for more, of course. One of the most important things about this agreement is that use or any use of that digital replica that's created for that project is limited. They cannot make any further use of that digital replica beyond what you have already consented to in your informed consent without coming back to you later, not at the time of initial employment, but later, to get your informed consent and negotiate compensation with you for any further use, for example, in another project, or to do anything else with it. The only exception to that, by the way, is for multi-picture deals. If they have enough information to give you the full informed consent information at the time of initial engagement, then only for multi-picture deals they can do that when you're engaged. But other than that, there is no franchise projects concept. There's nothing where they can make use of that digital replica without getting informed consent at the time of use. And so that is the sort of boundaries around the use of digital replicas that are created as part of a project that you're engaged for. But we also recognize that there will probably be projects in the future where our members may have created their own digital replicas. They may have partnered with third-party companies to do that. And there may be times when the studios would be licensing your digital replica from you or from a third party you've partnered with. And even in those cases, you will have an independent right of informed consent and compensation under this contract. So even though you will have perhaps made an independent licensing deal with the company will also have to give you all the detailed informed consent information, the reasonably specific details about the intended use of that replica, and you will have an independent right under our collective bargaining agreement to say yes or no to that. And if you want to negotiate additional compensation for that as well, if that wasn't taken care of in the licensing process. That compensation will include pension and health contributions, which normally would not be something you could negotiate in an independent licensing agreement. So that's provided for under our contract as well to make sure that you are covered, whether there is an employment-based digital replica or an independently created digital replica. Let's go on to the next slide. So another area that's covered in our contract is limitations on the use of AI to engage in digital alteration. And the concept behind this is right now, there's a certain amount of alteration that can be done using traditional editing techniques or CGI or VFX. And the fact is that the companies insisted on continuing to be able to do what they can do now with those tools, even if they're going to use an AI mechanism to carry out those same types of edits. And the digital alteration section is largely limited to that. There is a clear and conspicuous informed consent requirement for any kind of digital alterations that are made, with the exception of a specific list of things that are lined up with what the companies have traditionally had the right to do, again, using editing, VFX, and CGI. There is a requirement that any kind of changes that are made under that provision must be substantially as scripted, performed, or recorded. So they can't add new scenes, they can't substantially change scenes, they can't sort of make something different than what was originally contemplated. And they are allowed to do the same sort of things that they could do, for example, when a double is permitted, typical post-production alterations, etc. One thing that's a bit new that's here is that there can be alterations of lip, face, or body movement or voice for the specific purpose of translation to a foreign language. And just to give you an example of what that means, there's a company called Flawless that we've been engaged with who uses AI technology to adjust the lip movements of performers to better match the dubbed translations that are done by voice actors, so that instead of having to modify the script of the project to have words that better match the lip movements of the original actors, they can in fact adjust those lip movements so that the translation can remain authentic to the original script. So that continues to use voice actors. That's not a voice synthesis situation or anything like that, but that is something that would be allowed under this agreement. Let's shift to the topic of generative AI. This is something that a lot of people are very interested in and concerned about, and understandably so. We felt it was really important to have protections regarding the use of generative AI in this contract, even though at this moment, generative AI is not the way in which AI is being used as a general matter in our world. Digital replication is something that is happening and that we expect to happen in the term of this contract. The use of generative AI, for example, to create synthetic fake performers is something that could happen in the future, and we want to build guardrails around it to make sure that there is protection. And those guardrails in this contract take the form of, number one, a notice requirement. If the companies are going to create any kind of synthetic fake performer, they must give notice to the union before they do that. And that is based on a broad protective definition of generative AI that we have in this contract, by the way. And we also have the right to bargain over compensation and consideration for any use of a synthetic fake performer. And that right to bargain is really important, because the right to bargain is how we help make sure that there's not an economic incentive for the companies to use synthetic fakes. Because if we can make sure that compensation for the use of any synthetic fake is parallel to or even more costly than the use of a human actor for that purpose, or a human actor's digital replica, then that helps remove any kind of economic incentive to go down that road. We also were able to negotiate a consent requirement for individual performers who have a recognizable facial feature incorporated into a synthetic fake created through a generative AI system, if those performers' facial feature is prompted by the use of their name. So it's attached to their name and their recognizable feature. And in that case, the companies have an obligation to go out and seek the individual consent of each such performer used, even in a synthetic fake that incorporates multiple performers as well. So I do want to just note, I mean, there have been questions asked about things like, why didn't we just get a sentence in the contract that says actors are humans? And, it is because that's one of the things that the Writers Guild negotiated in their contract. But it's really important for everyone to understand that our contract is not structured like the Writers Guild contract. There is not minimum hiring requirements in our contract for principal performers, for any performer for that matter. And so having a statement that says actors are humans might feel good, but it doesn't provide any legal protection against the use of digital replicas, against the use of synthetic fakes, because the producers aren't required to hire actors. So what actually needed to happen in this contract is to create actually legally enforceable protections that prevent the companies from abusing AI with your image, your likeness, your voice, etc. And saying actors are humans would not have accomplished that. So that's why that's not a feature of this contract. Instead, what's a feature of this contract is what I think will turn out to be 15, 16 pages of detailed contract language, providing specific limitations on what the producers can do, what the studios and streamers can do as it relates to AI. And that's in place of a literal blank page. Prior to that, there were no limitations, no restrictions in our existing contract. There's literally nothing about it. So it's really important as we write on this blank page to include enforceable, practical limits so that we can actually make sure that our members are protected. Finally, I want to just note that as part of this agreement, there's a commitment on the part of the studios and streamers to meet with us at least twice a year to discuss what they're doing with generative AI, and to also help us ensure that as they use generative AI, even for things that maybe our members themselves are not directly part of, that there is a specific effort made to mitigate against the incorporation of biases from the past into training sets that are used to train AIs. So if they're going to use a generative AI to make certain types of decisions or to help them make certain types of decisions or whatever, we want to make sure that those training sets are dealt with in a way that eliminates bias rather than perpetuating it. So I think we can go on to the next slide. Let's talk about AI as it relates to background actors. So background actors are protected, just as principal performers are, against any kind of abuse from AI in the same ways. First of all, I want to just mention that for background actors, unlike principals, as you may know, there are a certain number of covered positions on projects that are within background zones. And so for those covered positions, there is a limitation in this agreement that those positions cannot be replaced by digital replicas. They have to actually hire those actors to work in those projects up to those numbers. Beyond those numbers is outside of our contract jurisdiction, and beyond those numbers, we don't have any control over what the companies do with respect to that. But for our members who are working in covered positions, they will have to hire actual background actors to fill those positions. They can, of course, seek your informed consent to create a digital replica of you, and again, seek your informed consent for the use of that digital replica. And all of those similar rules that I talked about before apply: the 48 hours notice, the clear and conspicuous informed consent, that the time spent creating the digital replica is work time. I do want to note that if there's any use as a principal performer of that digital replica, then that will require compensation plus P&H and residuals based on the time it would have taken to do that work. And there is a requirement for that fully informed consent and fair compensation for use in any other projects, any other pictures, whatever. Also, it's important to note that the use of the background actor's digital replica cannot be used to evade the engagement of that background actor. And what that means is when you take that in combination with the limitations on replacing below the count background actors with digital replicas, that means that if a digital replica of you is created and it's going to be used, either you will have to be hired for that day and work that day as an actor, or you'll have to be paid for that day as part of the engagement language. So there is no ability to use your digital replica without compensating you, at least at scale, for those uses. And I think that's an important protection. There's also similar provisions regarding digital alteration of background actors, and we already talked about digital alteration, but the part that's different that I want to highlight is if digital alteration is used to adjust the lip or facial movements of a background actor to make it look as though they're speaking a line, even though they may not have done that in the actual scene when it was recorded, that will trigger a upgrade to principal if it is made to look like they're speaking a line, and for reasons that I think probably are apparent. So let's move on to our next topic. And I think, Ray, I think this one's yours.
Yes. So this is our high budget SVOD streaming bonus achievement. This was our search to find another source of revenue for performers working on made for streaming shows. So for those performers who are working on a high budget SVOD season of a series, a mini series, or a long form picture that hit a defined success metric, there's going to be an extra payment. That success metric requires that the production be watched by at least 20% of that service's domestic subscribers during the first 90 days of an exhibition year. So if that happens and it triggers that success metric, then there's an additional payment due. The payment that goes to the performers who are on the show or the season of the show that triggered the success metric is going to be equal to 75% of the annual residual that is due for that program. So they're going to get another 75% of their residual. An additional 25% of that residual is going to be paid into a streaming bonus distribution fund. That fund is going to have AMPTP trustees, and it is going to have union trustees, and those trustees together are going to develop a set of distribution guidelines so that that money can go to other programs that are on the same streaming service made by the same company, in addition to what goes to the folks who are on the show that triggered the success metric. So we will be able to distribute that money more broadly to benefit more members on more shows through the streaming bonus distribution fund, using that 25% of the residuals that is going to go into that fund. And that will enable us to both reward the folks who are on the shows that triggered the success metric and spread that money more broadly. Next slide, please. We also achieved a lot in the area of advanced payment of residuals. The problem that we have had in this area is that it is often unclear to performers that they are being advance paid their residuals. The money looks like initial compensation money to them. And so often they think that they have achieved their quote in negotiations, but they really haven't, because some of the money that they got is actually a prepayment of residuals. And that becomes very upsetting later on when those residuals come due and the performers learn, actually, no, we're not getting those residuals because we've already been paid them with money that looked like initial compensation. And so there are various ways by which this agreement is going to address that problem. The first is a requirement of a separate rider, separate document for advance pay that spells out specifically in numbers how much money you're getting in initial comp and how much is the advance payment of your residual. So it will become very apparent to you as you sign your contract what that is. As well, the advance pay residual money has to come in the form of a separate check and be processed by the union just like a residual. So it will look very different to you when you get it. It will not look like you're getting paid your initial compensation. It will look like a residuals check. The exception is if you're using direct deposit, then your initial comp and your advance paid residuals can be deposited together, but you have to receive reporting that differentiates what's what in terms of the money that was deposited into your account. And so that's the better reporting that we're going to get as far as making more clear to members what is initial comp and what is the advance payment of a residual. In addition to that, we achieved a new limitation on how much you can be advance paid. So for performers that are guaranteed less than $75,000 per week or per episode, no more than 15% of your compensation can be treated as the advance payment of a residual. That's a limitation that we have in our Netflix agreement that is now going to apply to the entire AMPTP and is going to serve as a new limit on advance pay. And I should mention, though it's not on the slide, that the existing thresholds that we have for advance pay are going to increase. So there are dollar figures in the contract that only money that you are being paid in excess of those dollar thresholds can be used as the advance payment of a residual. And those thresholds are going to increase. So that is going to decrease the amount of money that is available to producers to use as the advance payment of a residual. And that will operate as yet another limitation on advance pay. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk to you about some improvements to the high budget SVOD residual formula. This is the residual formula that will apply to a made for subscription streaming program for its continued exhibition on the platform that it was made for. The way this residual works, it starts with what you were paid for the job. That's referred to in the contract as total actual compensation. Whatever that number is subjected to a cap. And then that capped number is multiplied against a specified percentage depending on which exhibition year you're in. So it's a declining percentage, meaning that the residual for older content will be less than the residual for newer content. So that's how you generate the base residual, and then that gets multiplied by a subscriber factor so that you get a bigger residual if you're on a platform with more subscribers. And that residual can also be reduced if you're on a platform with fewer subscribers. So with that as the background, let's go through some of the changes that were made to that formula to benefit you. The first is that the cap, I mentioned that your earnings are subjected to a cap. That cap is going up by 2.5%. So that means more of your money counts into the formula. As well, that exhibition year percentage that I mentioned for years 8 through 12, that's going to increase. So as for older content on the platform, that's also going to further increase the residual number. So those are two of the changes that were made to improve the residual. Another change, and perhaps the biggest change that was made to the residual formula, is a change in how your foreign SVOD residuals are calculated. Now, your foreign residuals for use on an affiliated foreign platform, Netflix UK or whatever the platform is, foreign platform, is calculated at 35% of your domestic residual. And that's going to change now. It's going to use the same formula using total actual compensation and the exhibition year percentages, but it's going to now apply a separate foreign subscriber factor that is going to account for how many subscribers the foreign platform has, and is going to calculate your residual as a complete separate foreign residual for SVOD, and that is going to make for a very significant increase to the amount of your foreign residuals. In addition to that, we are eliminating the 35% crediting of scale that apply to certain smaller platforms. In addition to that, we're going to eliminate the grandfathering for any new seasons of an existing series. This formula has been steadily improved since it was first introduced in 2014, and there are some older shows that are still under an older version of this formula. That's what the grandfathering means. And now, for new seasons of those shows, they're going to get the full benefit of the new formula. So that grandfathering is going to go away. In addition to all of that, we're going to get increased transparency and reporting obligations to get streaming viewership details. That's very significant because up until this point, streaming has been a black box. There's never been an equivalent to, say, a Nielsen rating like you have on broadcast television that tells you how well or poorly your show is doing. We have had no visibility into that until now, and we are now going to get viewership reporting that helps us with that. And finally, the last change I'll talk about is that I mentioned that there is a subscriber factor so that the residual is higher for bigger platforms and lower for smaller platforms. The two smallest subscriber tiers are going to be eliminated. Those are the 20% and the 40% tiers. They're going away. So now for the smallest platforms, it will be at least 65% of the residual. So that's another way in which the formula is improving. Next slide, please. Some additional changes in the area of residuals. Some of these are producer proposals that we have agreed to. So, for example, there's been a modification to the promotional rerun formula when launching a new primetime series. Right now, it's the first 3 episodes can be rerun once within a certain window of time without payment. So instead of it being the first 3 episodes, it's going to be any 3 episodes. We have a provision for the limited theatrical release of a television program that allows the producer to pay 9% distributors' gross receipts based residual instead of the fixed residual under Section 19 of the TV agreement. That's been expanded now to include pictures of 66 minutes or longer, feature-length pictures basically made for high-budget SVOD platforms. That's now included in that. There's been a modification to the theatrical promotional exhibition section, which right now is limited to series that have not yet aired their final episode, and that limitation is going to be removed. There is also an increase of 3% to the foreign overage thresholds. This impacts how residuals are paid for foreign free television. That residual starts with a fixed residual of 35% of minimum, but once the revenue under that license exceeds a certain threshold, you start to get paid again under a distributor's gross receipts-based formula, and those thresholds are going to go up by 3%. Finally, there has been a change to the new media inspection language to make the inspections annual and to require 30 days notice instead of 10 days notice. And that's it for this slide. So next slide, please. We had a lot of changes in this negotiation to the casting process. This was one of the hottest issues during our wages and working conditions process. And there was a real sense among the members that the self-tape process in particular had become abusive. And so we have set a number of parameters in this area. So the first is your turnaround time for submitting on a self-tape request has to be at least 48 hours excluding weekends and holidays. So you have your weekends back from self-taping. And that's expanded to 72 hours for minors. There's also a limit on how much you can be expected to record for a self-tape. So that's 8 pages for a first self-tape and 12 pages for a second or subsequent self-tape. You cannot be asked to memorize. So you have to be allowed to hold sides or use a prompter. There is a transparency provision now that allows you to request or ask whether the role has already been cast so that you can know whether you want to submit that self-tape if the role has already been cast. You might still want to do it. You might want to use your time for something else. Under this language, you can ask the producer and they have to endeavor to respond to you. There is a limitation now that you may not be asked to use any paid editing software or any specific equipment in connection with your self-tape. There is a standardized slate that's provided for, so only certain information can be requested as part of the slate. There is a prohibition on nudity. You cannot be asked to wear anything more revealing than a swimsuit you would wear to a public pool. There is a prohibition on stunts on a self-tape. For dancers, the producer has to provide you with the music and the choreography. The amount that they can ask you to do is limited to 4 8-beat counts. The choreography has to be something that can be performed in an 8x8 space, and they can only ask for solo performances. They cannot ask you to go recruit your friends for partner performances or for multi-person dances. They can only ask for solo performances. Your self-tape has to be stored securely in a way that only people with a legitimate business interest can have access to it. If they want to use a self-tape for any public-facing purpose, they have to come get your consent at the time of use. So it can't be made a condition of submitting the self-tape. They can't ask at the time of submission. Only when they decide that they want to use it do they have to then come back to you and get your consent to do that. And for those members who don't like self-tape, would prefer another means of auditioning, the producer must make available a window for in-person or live virtual auditions that you can sign up for if you would prefer another means of auditioning other than self-tape. Next slide, please. Other changes to the casting process. There is a provision now that talks about virtual interviews and auditions, so a Zoom audition. The same transparency language that I discussed above applies there. Again, there is a prohibition on any paid meeting sites, editing software, or specific equipment being required. You cannot be asked to memorize without triggering the payment provisions that already exist in our schedules for that. There may be no nudity. It's the same standard. Nothing more revealing than a swimsuit you would wear to a public pool. As well, you cannot be asked to remove any cover-up until you are in a private virtual setting with only casting personnel. You cannot be asked to do a stunt in a virtual interview or audition. And again, for dancers, same rules. They have to give you the music, the choreography. It's limited to 4 8-beat counts, has to be done in an 8x8 space, and only solo performances. Same rules on secure storage if they decide to record that virtual interview or audition. And again, same rules on public use. They have to come get that consent from you at the time of use. How will we handle disputes under these new provisions? This was a real fight. There was a strong desire by the producers not to have grievance and arbitration apply here, but that was not the result. The way this will work is there is a 6-month moratorium on claims, although the producers have encouraged us to report to them any violations that we find in that 6-month window so they can work on bringing themselves into compliance. And so in turn, we ask of you that you would report to us those violations so that we can assist with that. After that 6-month moratorium, any claims that we bring under this language will first be referred to a conciliation committee to see if it can be resolved. And failing that, it will be subject to grievance and arbitration. So we can arbitrate this language. For general casting calls, you may not be charged a fee or subjected to less preferential treatment because you didn't pay a fee for getting access to audition materials, for submitting your self-tape. There can be no fees charged for any of that. And so any of the services that require that have to now provide you with an alternative that does not involve the charging of a fee. The AMPTP has agreed that they're going to talk to us about geographic discrepancies in how roles are cast and paid, which is a real concern, in particular for our members outside of Los Angeles and New York. There is now specific language requiring accommodations in the casting process for performers with disabilities, for seniors, and for minors. So very comprehensive set of changes to casting. Next slide. I think we're back to you, Duncan.
Yes, great. Thanks, Ray. So next, we want to talk a bit about pension and health contributions. So increases to the benefit plan contribution caps for episodic work, which are long overdue, will generate, we project, more than $180 million in additional contributions to the benefit plans over the term of the contract. And they're also going to help people working in these types of programs to continue qualifying for coverage because, of course, it means more of their earnings will qualify for earnings credit in the plan. So for half-hour projects, that will increase by 67% from $15,000 to $25,000 per episode. And for our projects, it will increase 43% from $24,500 to $35,000 per hour per episode. And that's really an important change because while in the past we've often used increases in the contribution rate to generate more contributions to the health, pension, and retirement plans, these changes actually result in members being able to qualify, more members being able to qualify for health benefits and for retirement benefits because of those increased caps. So in addition to generating more money, it also generates increased ability to gain eligibility. So very happy about that. We can move on to the next slide, which is regarding performance capture. And so after more than 2 decades of efforts to get formal recognition of performance capture in this contract, we have finally been able to achieve that. And for the first time, the companies are confirming coverage of performance capture services, both for live action theatrical and TV motion pictures, and also for animated theatrical motion pictures, which is what's covered by this contract. And that is, despite many, many years of the companies choosing to cover some of the work that's done in this area under this contract, but without acknowledging that it is a formally covered service under this agreement. Now it will be. For performance capture actors working in performance capture, they will be covered by the terms of the applicable schedule, whether it's schedule A, B, C, F, G, H, J. There are some exceptions built in there. A couple of the things that were not everything that we wanted in this provision. There is an exception, an exclusion for consecutive employment and for drops and pickups, which is something that we anticipate attacking in a future round of bargaining. But it was crucial for us to finally achieve this recognition with the benefits that it contains, especially for the many people who work in this area who have sometimes not been covered under this contract, such as dancers, stunt performers, and others sometimes. It is also important to note that this provision is limited in that it does not cover motion capture services as defined. And that is something we also, I think, will need to push back on in future rounds of bargaining, which is to narrow the definition of what's considered motion capture services. It also excludes reference capture or reference modeling. Reference modeling, as an example, being something that has traditionally been excluded historically under this contract. If we continue on, let's move on to talking about Schedule F performers. There are increased minimums in the Schedule F thresholds that will result in more money in Schedule F performers' pockets because employers are very committed to engaging people under Schedule F in certain cases because of the ability to then bargain over certain terms that otherwise they can't bargain over under our contract. And that means as Schedule F minimums go up, a number of performers who are being paid right at that Schedule F threshold will also see their earnings go up as well. So for theatrical motion pictures, Schedule F is going from $65,000 per picture to $80,000 per picture. For half-hour TV and new media motion pictures, it's going from $32,000 per episode to $37,500 per episode. For 1 hour and longer TV and new media motion pictures, it's going from $32,000 per episode to $45,000 per episode. And for multi-part closed-end motion pictures, it's going from $40,000 per episode per picture to $47,500 per picture, and from more than $4,650 per week to more than $5,150 per week. And if you take a look at all of those in comparison to their starting points, that's a range of increases between 17 to 40% in the minimum threshold for Schedule F. So we think that's going to be very beneficial in a number of ways. Continuing on, I think this one is you, Ray.
Yes, we'll talk about series regulars and option terms. So right now, there are protections in the collective bargaining agreement that talk about when your option has to be exercised. However, those protections only apply if you are making $32,000 or less per episode. We are now expanding the coverage of those protections by increasing that money break so that for half-hour shows, you have the benefit of those protections if you are making less than $65,000 per week or per episode. And for hour shows, that number is $70,000 per week or per episode. It will remain at $32,000 only for minors on children's programming. The substantive protections themselves are being modified and improved such that the option period is 18 months, but it's 18 months starting with the commencement of principal photography on the season, so that the actual production period of that season is included in the 18-month option window. Right now it's 12 months, but it starts at the end of principal photography. And so the option period doesn't even the clock doesn't even start ticking until after production on your season is done. That 18-month period can be extended up to 3 times by up to 3 months for each such extension, but they have to pay for that. And for each extension, they have to pay, your episodic rate. They have to give you an episode of compensation, and it's non-creditable. So it has to be new money. It can't be a prepayment of money that comes due later. New money, one episode for each extension. A new area of regulation in this option language has to do with the start date. Right now, there are no limitations on when you can be started for the next season, or at least they start to pay you. So oftentimes, if your option gets exercised, you may still be waiting for a long time before you start to work and get paid on the next episode, or rather the next season of the series. There is now a requirement that you have to be started, or your pay has to start no more than 3 months from the end of the end of that option period referenced before. They can extend that amount of time once only for a maximum of 2 months, but they have to pay an episodic fee, and that episodic fee is the subsequent season episodic fee. And again, it's not creditable. It has to be new money that you're getting in exchange for that extension. For those performers, series regulars who are over the money break, so they're making 65 or more, or 70 or more $1,000 per week or per episode, such that they don't have the benefit of these protections. If while they are under option, they lose their health insurance because they have been prevented from going and getting other work to qualify, then under that circumstance now, the employer has to make a special payment to the health plan to extend their health insurance so that they do not lose health insurance under those conditions. Next slide, please. There are also very significant improvements for series regulars in the area of the relocation allowance. This is what applies if you are asked to move somewhere else for the production of your show. If you're an LA-based performer and you're asked to go to Atlanta to work on your show, because that's where the production is based, then you get a relocation allowance. Right now, the relocation allowance is $10,000 per season, and it only applies for either 2 seasons or 4 seasons, depending on the size of the series order. So that's going to change now, and it's going to be $5,000 per month for up to 6 months of that season. So basically from $10,000 to $30,000 if your season goes that long. Importantly as well, there is no limit on the number of seasons. So they have to continue to pay you this relocation money for as long as you're relocated on that series. Based on employment patterns, this amounts to 153% increase in relocation allowances. The one limitation that I'll mention is that if you are currently a series regular and you have exhausted the maximum number of relocation allowances for that show under the current contract, then you are not eligible for these improvements in that one circumstance. Next slide, please. We have increased the span money break for the first time in the history of the contract. So this is the money break. You have to be paid at least this much money in order for the producer to be able to bargain without limitation with you on the subject of overall production times. This isn't work time, but this is the overall production time within which your work days have to happen. That has increased from $20,000 to $25,000 per episode, from $100,000 to $125,000 for a series presented in a combined series format, and from $150,000 to $190,000 for a 13-episode guarantee. Next slide, please. Some new provisions for guest stars as well. Right now, and this will really affect mainly recurring guest stars, but right now you have the ability under our contract to engage a performer with no start date. So they can hire you for the episode without giving you any indication of when the work is actually going to happen. And for a recurring guest star, this creates a great difficulty in finding other work because you cannot firmly commit to any schedule for the second position producer because you don't know when you're going to be called in to work under your recurring guest star contract. That has been improved so that now they must at least provide you with a soft work window, and that window will be the guaranteed period of employment, however much work you're guaranteed, plus or minus 5 days. So that is, they have to give you that information about when the work is going to start. If you get another job within that soft work window, you can go to your employer, and within 24 hours, excluding weekends and holidays, they have to tell you either we're giving you a firm work date that conflicts so that you can't take that job, or they have to move the soft work window to accommodate your job. If, however, they move that soft work window to accommodate your other job, and it becomes impossible to reschedule you to complete your work as under your guest star agreement, then they will only have to pay you in that circumstance for work you actually did. And if there's an unpaid balance of a guarantee that you haven't done the work for yet, they will not have to pay you that. Next slide, please. Improvements as well in the area of major role minimum under our contract. Very significantly, that now applies to half-hour and hour programs made for high-budget SVOD platforms, so very big expansion of major role. And it applies as well now to the first season of a paid television series, where it previously only applied to second and subsequent seasons of a paid television series. So much more eligibility now for the major role provisions. Next slide, please. Some new forms of engagement agreed to in this agreement may be familiar to some of you if you've worked under the Netflix contract or are familiar with its terms. And those are the modified deal performer and modified guest performer forms of engagement. For a modified deal performer, you have to be guaranteed at least $21,538 per episode. And that number will go up by the amount of any wage increases, so that number continues to climb. For each episode that you are guaranteed that money and you've been engaged for, the producer gets 10 work days that have to occur each within a 30-day period. So for each episode, they get 10 work days and 30 days of overall production time. The residuals will be calculated for that using total applicable minimum salary based on 2 weeks at scale for each episode for those formulas that are based on TAM. And then there's a junior version of that, which is the modified guest performer. For a modified guest performer, you have to be paid at least $14,000 per episode. And again, that number will increase by the general wage increase. For each episode that you are engaged this way, the producer gets 8 work days, and those work days have to occur within a 23-day period. Again, that's for each episode. The TAM-based residuals in this case are going to be calculated based on 1 week and 3 prorated days. Importantly, the way the work days themselves get scheduled is regulated by the contract. So when you are first engaged under either of these forms, they have to schedule your work days for the first 30-day or 23-day period at the time of engagement. And then going forward, they have to schedule your work days at least 14 days in advance. And this is designed to maximize your ability to find other work even while you are engaged under one of these forms of engagement. Next slide, please. Some changes in the area of consecutive employment. There would now be 3 drop pickups per episode or part for a day player on a series or a miniseries. And the pickups can be a soft pickup date. So that is the pickup date plus or minus 4 days. And you could be picked up as a daily, a 3-day, or a weekly. For weekly performers on a series or a miniseries, there are now 2 drop pickups per episode or per part. And it's the same soft pickup date formula of plus or minus first 4 days. And as well, you can be picked up there as either a daily, a 3-day, or a weekly. Next slide, please. Some changes in the area of franchise projects, and that's defined as a series of related projects that have common settings, characters, and/or storylines. And if you are engaged on more than one franchise project at the same time, and there is a day that is a whole day on one franchise project and a work day on the other franchise project, then you get paid for your work day, but not the whole day. And as well, if there is a day that is a whole day on multiple franchise projects on which you are engaged, then you get paid at the highest applicable rate, but you will not get paid for multiple whole days. And finally, with respect to reuse of photography or soundtrack, the producer can bargain with you for consent to reuse photography or soundtrack at the time of engagement, but only for reuse in another franchise project. And there's an exception there for nudity and bloopers. That consent still has to be obtained at the time of use, even for use from one franchise project into another. Next slide, please. A very big breakthrough here on the subject of high budget advertiser supported video on demand. This is advertiser supported streaming where the consumer doesn't pay. If it's a hybrid scenario, by the way, because this has been asked, where it's like the ad supported tier of Netflix where there's advertising and a subscription fee, that is SVOD. That's high budget SVOD. It's not high budget AVOD at all. But in the high budget AVOD space where the consumer doesn't pay, right now, this is completely free bargaining. There is no application of scale in this space. As well, there is only a handful of the standard terms of the television agreement that apply here. And that's going to change under these terms such that the television terms essentially will apply just like high budget SVOD or just like TV to this programming. The exception is there are a handful of terms where the 2020 version of those terms will apply rather than the 2023 version of those terms. But outside of that, it will be treated just like TV or just like high budget SVOD. The way residuals will work is that your initial compensation will cover 26 weeks of exhibition on the platform for which the program was made. If it remains on that platform beyond that 26-week period, then there's a residual due at 6% of distributors' gross receipts. There's P&H paid on top of that residual. And if it moves to a paid television, or it moves to a paid new media platform, rather, then the residual is 3.6% of distributors' gross receipts, and that's inclusive of P&H. These are the traditional formulas that apply to other forms of programming in these spaces. As well, for any reuse in traditional media like TV or home video, then the traditional residual formulas that apply to other forms of content will also apply here. Next slide, please. Duncan, I think you're back.
I am. So let's talk about background actors. And first of all, with respect to wages, I think I mentioned earlier that we were going to come back to this topic. We also have an unprecedented wage pattern for background actors, also with 2 wage increases in the first year of the contract. And I want to just emphasize that part of this was because we recognized during the negotiation process that the impact of inflation really hits people at the lowest end of the earnings scale the hardest, because necessities are necessities and you can't really avoid buying necessities or defer it, et cetera. So in this wage pattern, there is a 11% general wage increase for background actors effective November 9th, and an additional 4% increase effective July 1st of next year. So during the first year of the contract, that translates into a compounded first year increase of 15.51% in background actors minimums. And there'll be an additional 3.5% increase for background actors on July 1st of 2025, just like there are for principals as well. Also, one of the things we really wanted to achieve in this negotiation was a single Schedule X, meaning equalization of all terms for engagement of background actors on all parts of the country, West Coast, East Coast, et cetera. We were not able to ultimately achieve a single Schedule X, but we did achieve equalizing the background count, the background numbers that are covered under our contract on both coasts for the first time in decades. And that is probably the single most important part of a single Schedule X, and it is a huge increase in employment for background actors. And so our projection is that increasing those numbers on the West Coast zones to match the East Coast zone numbers will generate an additional 10,700 days of covered background work annually under this contract. And of course, it also frees us up to continue fighting for increased numbers that will apply to everybody in future rounds of bargaining. So that's something that I think is something we should all be very pleased about. Continuing on with respect to background actors, there will be there's a new provision that stand-ins on half-hour multicam shows who rehearse and or perform in the role of a cast member during a run-through will receive an additional $150 bump plus pension and health contributions on that bump. And photo doubles who are required to memorize and deliver scripted dialogue on camera will also receive an additional $150 bump plus P&H on that as well. We also agreed to provide for tolling of the accrual of late pay liquidated damages in the event of a bona fide dispute when it arises in the context of a claim or a grievance relating to background actors. This is the same rule we've long had in place for principal performers, and so that is a change that we made to make that process the same, regardless of which type of performer you are. Continuing on, let's talk about stunt coordinators. For the first time, we've been able to achieve fixed residuals for television stunt coordinators who aren't performing on-camera stunts. This is consistent with the provision that we were able to bargain with Netflix in our separate negotiation with them last year. This is not, a perfect provision. This is a start. This is breaking the wall on that the companies have long held on including stunt coordinators in fixed residuals, because as you know, they've been willing to include stunt coordinators in pooled residuals where it doesn't cost the company any more money, but where fixed residuals where it does cost more money, they have held the line on that up until this negotiation. So we've broken through that wall, and we will definitely be looking to expand upon the formula that's used for the calculation of those fixed residuals for stunt coordinators in future rounds of bargaining. We also wanted to equalize the flat rate deal rates between television and theatrical in this negotiation. We didn't achieve a full equalization, but we were able to make improvements that move us part of the way there. And so TV flat deal stunt coordinator rates will have outsized increases of 10%, 6.5%, and 5% during the term of the contract, which, as I said, doesn't get us all the way there or even quite halfway there, but it does move us in the right direction of trying to equalize those rates. And it's definitely something we'll need to come back to in a future round of bargaining. Also, we heard about how flat deal stunt coordinators were being really abused by being asked to come into set earlier than they needed to and being held on set longer than they needed to be. And this resulted in limitations on their rest periods and not being able to really rest and recharge as they need to. For that, we were able to convince the AMPTP to issue a bulletin to producers directing them not to have flat deal stunt coordinators come in earlier than necessary or stay later than necessary for the supervision of stunt activity. And we think that will have a beneficial impact on making sure stunt coordinators have the rest that they need, and we'll definitely be monitoring that closely to make sure it's complied with. Continuing on, talking about singers, they'll now be the vocal contractors fee will now be paid on top of multi-tracking and or sweetening. So that's a change. And singers who are required to dance, whether it's in rehearsal or on camera, will receive a bump of 25% of the applicable dancer rate. So they will no longer be expected to do that multi-functional performance with no additional compensation. So that's a good improvement. And on the next slide for dancers, we'll see in the middle a parallel provision where dancers who are required to sing or lip sync, whether it's in rehearsal or on camera, will also receive a 25% bump of the applicable singer rate. Again, to make sure that dancers aren't expected to do that work without additional compensation. In the dancer area, we're also eliminating rehearsal rates, which is a big achievement. It's something I know dancers have really wanted for a long time, because rehearsals are just as hard, if not harder, than on-camera days, and yet they were paid for at a discount up until now. Going forward, rehearsal days, we paid the same as on-camera days for dancers. And there's also a provision that will require the companies to improve their efforts to provide warm-up space that is adjacent to set, so that it's not, the purpose of warming up isn't defeated by having, but by having a long journey between the warm-up area and set. So let's talk about holidays. Effective January 1st of 2024, there will be 2 new holidays, Martin Luther King Jr. Day and Juneteenth, both of which are going to be great additions to our list of holidays. Martin Luther King Jr. Day in particular, long needed and long awaited. So very happy to have both of those holidays added to our list of official holidays under the contract. Moving to the area of equity and inclusion, there will be additional provisions to protect access to healthcare. For those who might not be aware of this right now, our health plan has a benefit that provides for coverage of travel expenses if one of our members is working in an area where there is restricted access to reproductive health care, so that they can go to a home, to wherever their home is, or to another jurisdiction where they can get access to that health care. But that left a gap where members who weren't eligible for the health plan yet, but might be working on location or working somewhere where there is a limitation in that access to healthcare, weren't protected, weren't covered in that regard. So the companies have agreed to a mechanism to provide funding for a travel benefit for performers who don't qualify for the health plan, so that they will also be able to have the cost of accessing that care in a different jurisdiction covered. We also have expanded that program to cover gender affirming care as well, since there's a number of jurisdictions where access to that kind of healthcare is limited. And so that will be protected here. And there also was an agreement between the bargaining parties to recommend to our health plan trustees to expand the health plan benefit so that it also covers gender affirming care. So with all of those pieces in place, our members who are working in a jurisdiction where there is limited access to reproductive or gender affirming healthcare will have support to pay for travel expenses so that they can go to a jurisdiction where they can get the healthcare that they need. As far as not yet, sorry. As far as translation goes, we're back on the previous slide. We now will have a provision that there can be no translation of your own or another performer's sides covered under the terms of this contract. If a producer wants a performer to do translation of any sides, slides meant sides, of any sides, then they need to negotiate with that performer separately and pay them for that. It's not a covered service under this contract, and they cannot include it in the work that you're doing for them as part of reviewing or preparing your sides. Continuing on now to the next slide, we have a new provision in regard to stunt doubling that requires producers to consult with the union to identify additional sources for qualified stunt performers that actually resemble the person they're doubling. This is important because a lot of times there have been justifications or excuses made for the use of inappropriate wiggings or paint downs because of a claim that they were unable to find any qualified stunt performer who resembled the person they're doubling. We want to help make sure that they are using all of the resources that are available to find such qualified stunt performers before anything like that happens. And we expect this new provision to help cut down on the amount of wiggings and paint downs that happen in the industry. And that's certainly a good thing. Next is hair and makeup equity. It's still on that same page. This is a consultation right that we now have for principal performers, where principal performers will have a right to have a consultation with hair and makeup staff from the production in advance, so they can be sure that the folks who will be working on their hair or their makeup are qualified to work on hair of all textures, to deal with all different complexions. And there's also an obligation on the part of production to make sure to have the necessary tools and supplies to work on performers with all different types of hair and all different types of skin. And that there will also be a notice that goes out from the AMPTP to all productions to advise them of this requirement that they must comply with. And there's a commitment to work with our industry partners, including IATSE, to expand and maintain a pool of qualified hair and makeup artists and to provide funding for training to help expand that pool. One shortcoming in this provision that we fought for but weren't able to achieve is the application of this same process with respect to background actors. And so that's something that we're going to have to keep fighting for in a future round of bargaining. But I expect that after we demonstrate that this is not only feasible, but really valuable in terms of showing proper respect for the inclusion of all of our members, that we'll have a good chance of getting that expanded. Next slide is regarding equity and inclusion. We are going to have a process for sharing self-identification data in the aggregate, so aggregated diversity statistics, back and forth between the companies and the union on an annual basis so that we can assess how the companies are doing in complying with their obligation to reflect the American scene in what in the projects that they're putting on stream and on air and they're producing. And so that's a very good thing. We also are eliminating the casting data report, which is an antiquated method of trying to assess how the companies are doing, where they would literally just have a PA or someone visually look at people and sort of decide in their own discretion what categories of performer they might fall into, or what disadvantaged groups they might represent. Instead, as I think many of you know, we've been engaged in the process of a diversity census within the union, and we will be able to cross-reference our own internal self-identification data with the employment data so that we can create much more accurate reports. And for the first time, this will absolutely include performers with disabilities, where the companies for many years have been resisting collecting data on employment of performers with disabilities. So we're very excited to have a more inclusive and more accurate set of reports based on this data. And finally, we have contract updates to update the language of the contract to reflect gender neutral language. Next, we're moving on to sexual harassment prevention. And first in this area is intimacy coordinators. We now have a contractual obligation on the part of the companies to engage intimacy coordinators, to use best efforts to engage intimacy coordinators for all scenes involving nudity or simulated sex, and also for other intimate scenes upon the request of any performer. And there is a prohibition on any kind of retaliation against a performer for requesting an intimacy coordinator, a specific prohibition on that. And this is really the culmination of many years of work establishing criteria for intimacy coordinator training programs and helping to build a registry of qualified intimacy coordinators so that there would be sufficient capacity to actually fulfill the industry's demand for intimacy coordination. And so very excited to see that we have been able to get this into the contract, and that will be something that happens going forward. We also will have increased notification of non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies so that all performers will receive notification in start paperwork or on vouchers. It'll also be presented in call sheets and in background holding areas to help make sure everybody knows what those policies are and how to report violations of them in the event that someone isn't living up to those standards. As far as background actors goes, for the first time, we'll have a requirement for advance notice if a role includes nudity or simulated sex. That advance notice has to happen if known prior to the audition or interview, can be presented in the casting notice, and has to be 48 hours in advance of call time so that there is time to really consider whether you want to do that role or not, so that this ends the practice of surprise casting with nudity or simulated sex involved. And this notice and information could come from the background casting agency as well as the producer. Finally, there's a commitment to reviewing and updating our harassment or the harassment prevention training programs that are in place in the industry to cover best practices for scenes involving nudity and simulated sex, and also to handle triggering scenes in a trauma-informed manner. And we think that'll provide a much more beneficial working environment for our members to have the relevant participants in the process better trained and better prepared for how to handle those things. So then in this slide, here's a list of all the other things that are included in this agreement. We had to be somewhat selective in what we included in the slide deck so that it didn't take up the entire time for all of our presentations. But as you can see, there's quite a few items here that are covered, and you can find details on all of these items in the summary that's been posted to the website. While I'm on the topic of the summary, which by the way can be found at sagaftra.org/contracts2023, right now there's an 18-page summary of the agreement. As I think many of you know, traditionally that's what has been provided as part of the ratification process. We've never had a full MOA drafted in time for ratification before. However, I know that there's a really great desire on the part of members to see drafted contract language for this agreement. So our team is working very hard to get the MOA done so that we can publish it. And I do expect us to be able to provide that to you during the ratification process. So you will be able to see that full drafted language if you want to do that. And we'll update you as soon as we have an exact timeframe for that. Ray, was there anything on this list that you particularly wanted to highlight? Or if not, what I would just say is people can certainly ask questions about any of these areas. If there's something you want to know more about, or you want to know what the details are here. And of course, you can find that information in the summary as well.
Yeah, I guess the only things I would specifically call out here, because we didn't have any other items that we discussed that were specific to minors, is that we do have improvements in the area of minors, that being there is a requirement now to continue to provide education to minors if they haven't completed the compulsory education under the laws of their state. Even if they are legally emancipated, they have to get onset education. There is a requirement now that anyone who is a welfare worker or working in a similar capacity, a teacher, a child labor coordinator, has to have a background check. And as well, there is language now authorizing background checks for anyone who works closely with minors. So just wanted to highlight those minors items.
That's great. Thank you for highlighting that, Ray. And actually, I had meant to say this earlier, but I do want to just emphasize that we have added some new AI resources to the ratification page on the website. So if you've checked out the ratification page before, but you haven't looked today, you might want to go back, especially if you're interested in the topic of AI, because there's some additional FAQs, et cetera, that are available on that ratification page now. So great. Well, why don't we go ahead and move into the question? The last slide. That's the website address that I just said, sagaftra.org/contracts2023. That's where you can find all of the materials, and that's where we will continue to upload additional materials as soon as they're available to answer additional questions, et cetera. So now I think we want to move into the Q&A process, and that means that I think the Q&A box is now enabled. And just as a reminder from what Pam had said earlier, you can simply put your questions into the Q&A box and we will go through and answer as many as we possibly can. Some of them will be answered in written form in response in the Q&A box. Some of them will answer live on the webinar. And of course, at the end, if it turns out we don't have enough time to get to all the questions, you'll be able to send in your question by email as well to tvtheatrical2023@sagaftra.org, and someone will respond to you in writing as well. So, great. Looks like questions are pouring in. So why don't we go ahead and get started so we can get as many questions in as we can, unless, I don't know, Pam, if there's anything else we need to do before we start that. Any other admin notes?
Not at all, Duncan. Go for it.
Okay, great. So the first question is, would significant edits made to our digital replicas, e.g. aging up / aging down, be permitted without further consent? Would such an edit remove our likeness and disqualify us from compensation and P&H? So to answer the latter part of that question first, no, it would not remove your likeness. It would not disqualify you from compensation and P&H at all. To the contrary, that absolutely would still be considered a digital replica, and you would still be entitled to everything just as you were before. As far as significant edits being made to digital replicas, the digital alteration section allows certain amount of editing, such as the application of cosmetics and things like that, to be done without specific consent. But as far as something like de-aging, aging up and aging down, that's something that would need to be part of the informed consent process that we talked about earlier. So that would be something that the company would need to inform you of, tell you as part of their intention to use your digital replica, and to gain your consent for if they were going to do that. Okay. Thanks for that question. Next question is, what protects an actor from losing a job based on their denial of AI use? So let's sort of break that up into two pieces. What protects an actor from being asked to agree to a creation of a digital replica as part of the process of being engaged for a project? Nothing stops that any more than something stops an actor from being asked to agree to relocation to a different country as part of a project, or being asked to agree to do certain nudity work as part of agreeing to take a role, that's part of the negotiation that as an actor you engage in with the producer. And ultimately, if their project requires the use of a digital replica and you don't wish to do that, then they may cast somebody else for that role. Having said that, if you've been engaged for a project and then the producer comes to you and says, we want you to make a digital replica, or maybe you were engaged and you agreed to certain things in your informed consent, and then they come back to you and say, oh, we want to expand on this, we want to do something different, then you can absolutely say no to that. And if you do say no to that and the company doesn't want to go forward, they're still going to have to pay you for that job under your contract. So they are not able to terminate your engagement based upon you declining to agree to something that they asked for as part of an informed consent process for digital replication. So that's sort of where that balance works out. Next question. Can you please go into details of what will happen if the contract doesn't pass? Will we immediately go back on strike, or will we go back to work under the contract we had before the strike? Does that mean go from some protection from AI to basically no protection at all, but no raises, etc.? So thanks for the question. If this contract were not ratified, we would have to go back to the negotiating committee and the national board to make decisions about how we would proceed. My expectation is that we would go back on strike, but that is a decision that the board would ultimately have to make. I don't see any likelihood of achieving better terms in this contract by simply having a rejected ratification and just going back into negotiations. There's no reason why we should think that that would happen. So I do believe that if the intent of a no vote was to try and change the terms of the agreement, the only way that could ever happen is by going back on strike, and probably for a significant period of time. But that's a decision that would be made by the national board. During any interim period, what would happen? Yes, we would be continuing to work under the terms of the old contract, which, as we've talked about, doesn't include any protections in regards to AI or digital replication or generative AI. And it's also worth noting that, of course, as part of a process like that, ultimately the employer, if we reach an impasse in bargaining, the employer can choose to implement their offer. So the companies could come back with an offer that excludes AI protections and then implement it. So there is real risk associated with a rejected ratification going back into that process. And I think people should understand that whether or not that would result in getting any kind of improved deal, it's very unlikely, and it's certainly very unlikely without going back on strike for an extended period of time. Okay, next question. What gains have stunt performers achieved in this TA? Secondarily, can synthetic performers be generated without human stunt performers' input and consent/compensation? What stands in the way of companies using digital replicas of actors instead of stunt performers? So what gains have stunt performers achieved in this TA? Well, obviously, there's the same generalized gains that everybody has achieved, including the increased minimums, including the AI protections, including all of the other terms of this contract that are beneficial. The increased residuals, etc. But assuming that what you're referring to is specific to stunt performers, I think really the gains in this contract are more focused on, have been more focused on stunt coordinators. Although I will point out that in the performance capture recognition part of the agreement, there is a specific acknowledgement of stunt performers as part of the groups of performers that would be covered under performance capture, which is, I think, a gain as well. In terms of your second question, can synthetic performers be generated without human stunt performers' input and consent or compensation? So just to make sure we're using the same terminology, when we say synthetic stunt performers, if by that we mean not a digital replica, but a generative AI created performer who doesn't really exist in the world at all, the answer is yes, they can be generated, but the companies would have to notify us of that fact, and the union would have a right to bargain over compensation for that. And the purpose of that bargaining over compensation is not so much to compensate a specific individual, because obviously if they're using a generative AI system to create something, it may be unclear what specific individuals would have been part of that, but it's to make sure that from an economic perspective, there's not an economic advantage to using synthetics as an alternative to human performers. And that is an important tool that we will have in our toolkit to address the use of generative AI. Obviously, if a recognizable facial feature of a particular stunt performer were used for some reason in the creation of a synthetic fake, then that stunt performer, just like any other performer, if they were prompted using the stunt performer's name, would have an individual right of consent, as we talked about earlier. What stands in the way of companies using digital replicas of actors instead of stunt performers? I think if individual actors, if individual principal performers choose to agree to allow the use of their digital replica for participation in a stunt, that is going to be a challenge, because there's really nothing that can stop the individual actor from agreeing to that, and the company from then doing that. From a technical perspective, however, I think it's important to recognize that at least for now, the cost factors associated with using digital replication instead of human stunt performers for the vast majority of stunts is probably not going to result in that happening during the term of this contract. So it's certainly something that we will monitor closely. And if we detect that is something that's developing or a trend, then that'll be something we would have in our hopper for addressing in the next round of bargaining as it relates to AI provisions. I think as a general matter, we need to recognize that we spent 118 days on strike. We fought hard for all of these limitations and provisions that we have achieved in AI. And the fact of the matter is that we are going to need to continue building on the guardrails that we have established in this contract, and we will do that in future rounds of bargaining with the additional leverage that we'll have at that time. Next question is self-tape / audition questions. One, why is self-tape defined? This is a long question, so just hang on there. Why is self-tape defined as distinct from audition? Is it exclusively to work around the studio system's audition compensation clause? And how does that affect performers' access to any historic protections around auditions, again, aside from studio system compensation clause? Is this because the AMPTP and SAG are moving towards self-tapes exclusively? 2, is there a sunset clause on the in-person / virtual option for self-tapes? If so, why? 3, can you please clarify this clause in auditions? J, provisions in the agreement related to interviews and auditions apply, except that any requirement to compensate a performer for waiting time is based on the day performer minimum, and sign-in sheet requirements are replaced with a requirement to maintain a record of performers, including name, agent's name, whether it was recorded, the call time, and any waiting time. Ray, I'm going to take the first part, and maybe if you don't mind taking the second and third part of that question, that'd be great. So, and for whatever reason, it keeps scooting up. Okay. Why is self-tape defined as distinct from audition? Really, in this contract, we have specific provisions that are related to self-tapes. And you're asking, is it to work around the studio system's audition compensation clause? We did not want to, our negotiating committee made the decision not to do anything to affect one way or the other the concept of audition pay in this negotiation. And so as far as the way the language is framed, the language has been specifically framed to make sure that we do not disadvantage the potential for audition pay claims, but we also did not want to take on that issue as part of the fight in this negotiation, given the other things that we needed to accomplish in self-tapes and elsewhere. So it is part of the structure of this agreement and the way the language is framed to help make sure that those claims are protected while addressing the needs that we had in self-tapes to make sure that certain abusive practices did not continue. So from my point of view, that is why the language is structured in the way that it is. It is not, to the last sentence in your question, it is not because there's any desire to move towards self-tapes exclusively. To the contrary, this contract explicitly provides a requirement that the companies make virtual auditions or in-person auditions available as an option. When we did our preparation for this negotiation, it was very clear a lot of members want self-tapes to remain. They do not want self-tapes to go away. They want the way that self-tapes are carried out to be less burdensome and less abusive. And that's what we focused on, was creating regulations and limitations to help balance things out with respect to self-tapes. But it wasn't our objective to ban them. And that was based on member feedback that we got during the WW process. Ray, can you take the other two parts of the question?
Sure. So is there a sunset clause on the in-person virtual options? Yes, there is a sunset clause, excuse me, at the end of the term of this contract, so June 30th, 2026. The reason for that is that a similar arrangement was agreed to between the AMPTP companies and the UBC, Union British Columbia Performers, UBCP, actor affiliate based in Vancouver. They have a similar arrangement in their agreement. And the experience was that as much as members there had also advocated for creating such an option, that when such an option was actually offered, very few people ever used it. So their casting directors made those times available, and people did not sign up for them for whatever reason. So that was something that was discussed explicitly in negotiations as, from the producer's perspective, a reason not to offer this alternative. However, we obviously didn't accept that rationale, insisted that we also have this alternative, agreed that we would sunset this language, and we'll see what happens with it. If people decide that they don't actually want in-person and virtual options and don't sign up for it, then we'll have to take that into consideration the next round of bargaining. As well, if it turns out that people do use it and we do not have the British Columbia experience in our union, then that will be taken into consideration. But that's the reason why. It's because the similar system that was adopted there was not popular and wasn't used by members. As far as clarifying the language that says, provisions, oh, sorry, this keeps moving on me. That the provisions that exist for audition pay and the schedules are going to be based, first of all, on day player minimum. The reason for that is it is presently ambiguous how they apply. There is a provision for some kind of payment, but in fact, these provisions are applying before you are engaged for work. So there is no opportunity to say that the waiting time pay that is referenced there is going to be based on your negotiated rate, because you haven't negotiated a rate yet. You're still in the audition process. And so, the likelihood is that this would be applied even under the existing language using the day player minimum as the basis, because there really isn't another basis to use. And then with respect to the remainder of that language, what has been carved out of the requirements for the sign-in sheet for an in-person audition that you don't have in a virtual audition are things like parking provisions, the things that just logically don't apply to virtual auditions. And so it was a different set of information, a slightly different set of information that we have required in connection with virtual auditions, basically just acknowledging the logic of the fact that they're virtual and people aren't actually attending in person.
Great, thank you, Ray. The next question is, a lot of people are clamoring to show us the contract. As I recall, we have only voted on the summary agreements in the past, and these summaries reflect all the relevant changes to our contract. Can you tell us why that is and address the accusations that somehow not having the quote-unquote full contract is some sort of deception on SAG-AFTRA's part? Well, yes, it is true that we have only ever had the summaries of tentative agreements in the past for ratification of these contracts, and that's because negotiating the exact language between the back and forth between the AMPTP and the union has typically taken a long time, and our contracts tend to be very long. I expect the ultimate MOA in this agreement to be around maybe 130 pages long or something, and that's dense contract language. So in the past, it's taken many weeks and sometimes months to actually finalize all that language. So I do understand, because a lot of people have reached out to me about it, that there is a strong desire on the part of members to see that. That is, like I said, it's not something we've ever done in the past, but we're working hard to make that happen so that we can release that MOA language before the end of the ratification period, and hopefully a lot sooner than that. So there's not anything going on about deception or anything like that. The summaries have all of the key provisions reflected in them. And like I said, that's how it's always been done before, but definitely open to trying
Can
to
I
do
add
it.
something?
Oh yeah, please do.
Yeah, I just want to sort of illustrate the point of why it's actually important that we take the necessary time to review the draft memorandum. I would just make the point that already in that review process, Jen Gaudry, who's on this call, found an omitted citation that is going to, and the fact that she caught it is going to have the result that stunt coordinators are going to get residuals for the free streaming window that we have for advertiser supported, or rather the free streaming window itself, whatever the original content was, is going to now get paid a residual to stunt coordinators because she very carefully reviewed this 130-page document and checked every citation. So I just want people to understand this isn't delay for the purpose of delay. This is delay for the purpose of ensuring that our members receive absolutely everything that you struck for and fought for in this negotiation, and that you do not lose substantive rights out of drafting, which, believe me, can happen if we don't do it carefully. So just to underscore the point, Duncan, I wanted to say that.
Great. Thanks, Ray. Appreciate that. Okay, next question. Duncan, can you go over again the part you mentioned regarding generative AI and why it doesn't help our particular contract to focus on what is human and why or how we made it more difficult to use generative AI? Also, may I have more clarification on how AI protections in this contract will not take work away from our stunt performers? So first of all, yes, the generative AI, the reason why it doesn't help our particular contract to just say actors are humans is that there's no obligation in this contract to hire actors. Like there's not any project where there is a contractual obligation to hire any actors. In the Writers Guild contract, there are minimum staffing requirements for projects, likewise in DGA contracts. And so it's not the case that just simply saying actors are humans gets you anything in this agreement, other than it gets you a feel-good moment. It feels great to say that. And by the way, actors are humans. That's absolutely something we all believe and we all know, and people across the table know it too. But the reality is what we needed in this contract was to protect our members from the current use of digital replication and the expanded use of digital replication using AI tools, and also to address what was going to happen with generative AI coming in the future. And so that's why we did that. And that's why we have many, many pages of specific limitations and regulations regarding the use of AI, rather than a sort of aspirational but unenforceable statement regarding actors being humans. And so I think that's where the fundamental answer to that. How we made it more difficult to use generative AI is really through the notice and bargaining process that I mentioned. There's also the individual consent. Obviously, if a generative AI tool is going to be used to create a synthetic that incorporates a recognizable facial feature of one of our performers alongside a prompt that involves their name, then that would trigger an individual right of consent. But on a broader basis, any use whatsoever of generative AI technology to create synthetic fake performers has to be noticed to the union. So we will know if it's happening, and we will know under what circumstances it's happening. And that's combined with a bargaining right so that we can bargain over compensation and other consideration related to the use of generative AI to create synthetic fakes. So that is a very big limitation on what the companies can do. It gives us insight into what's happening as they and if they start using generative AI to create synthetic fake performers. And I do want to just also remind everybody, we haven't talked about it that much because it's not specifically part of this contract, but just a reminder that under US copyright law, AI creations are not eligible for copyright registration. So the fear that a project is going to be created entirely using synthetic AI generated performers is, that is a less likely development because these companies need to have copyright protected content in order to monetize it. And that's where their money comes from. That's how their businesses operate. So that is an incredibly important principle. It's been established by our Copyright Office and upheld by the courts. And it is, I think, going to benefit actors as well as writers and directors and other creative professionals who are part of the creation process. That, combined with the limitations that we have on generative AI, I think really does give you reason to set aside some of the more sort of catastrophizing, fear-based statements that some people make about the future of acting and the future of the industry. And I would also just remind everybody that we'll be renegotiating this contract in 2.5 years. We'll be starting the WW process even sooner than that. And one of the things that we will have the benefit of is we'll have the benefit of having advance notice of the use of this technology, if it's happening, to create synthetic fakes so that we can then respond to that in real time. So I think that's a very important aspect of it. To your question about clarification on how AI protections will help avoid the taking of work away from stunt performers. Well, first of all, on the generative AI front, it's what I just talked about, having the ability to know in advance if synthetic fake stunt performers are being created and having the ability to bargain over compensation for that so that it's not economically advantageous is really important, because one of the things we know is these economics drive the company's decision making. And so having the ability to influence those economics is key. Also, of course, the fact that any kind of replication that might occur of stunt performers, particularly stunt performers who aren't doubling someone, that is limited by the digital replication provisions of this contract, just like any other performer. So I think those are two ways in which stunt performers are protected. Is there absolute protection against the loss of an opportunity for a stunt performer because a principal performer decides to authorize the use of their digital replica to do something that might have otherwise been done by a stunt performer? No, there's not absolute protection against that, although we certainly keep an eye on that and see if that is a developing trend, and if so, we can seek to address that in the next round of bargaining. But then again, there's not a protection against that happening right now. There are obviously performers who choose to do their own stunts, some of them famously so, and so that's a reality that we have to navigate in both the digital world and the non-digital world. Next, can you go into detail regarding the AI consent/pay loopholes for Schedule F performers and in satire/historical projects? Sure. So first of all, as far as the provisions regarding AI consent and pay, I guess I'll object slightly to the term loophole, because there is no loophole for consent for Schedule F performers or anyone else. The fact that you're Schedule F doesn't change what kind of informed consent the producers have to get from you, the studios and streamers have to get from you. And the Schedule F part only relates to the question of payment and the compensation that would be applied. In employment-based digital replicas, if a performer is a Schedule F performer, then there is no requirement that there is additional payment made for the use of their digital replica. And the reason for that is a Schedule F performer generally has unlimited work time, which means that the producer could have called you in to do that same work in person, and you would have had to show up and do it, and you wouldn't have gotten paid extra for it. So therefore, if the producer is going to use your digital replica to do it with your fully informed consent instead of you, then that's why you wouldn't get paid extra for your digital replica doing it, because you wouldn't have gotten paid extra if you would have done it in person. Obviously, there could be some potential benefits for our Schedule F performers in that situation. For example, if a Schedule F performer would have been required to come back to do reshoots, but instead a digital replica is going to be used to do that, then that Schedule F performer is now available to do other work on those times and potentially earn additional money as a result. And of course, all of that is governed by the informed consent provisions in the contract. So none of it can be done without the informed consent of the Schedule F performer. As far as the satire and historical projects, this is solely for the use of independently created digital replicas, which is that there is a First Amendment concern that's been raised in terms of making sure that things that third-party companies would have the right to do with the publicly available materials, that the companies not have their hands tied in comparison to other non-signatory entities that might do the same thing with those materials. So there is a provision that that takes into account those First Amendment protected items, and there's a list in the summary of what those specifically are. But that is a pretty narrow exception that applies only in the context where a third party would have a First Amendment protected right to do those same things without the permission of the copyright owner of the underlying material. So that's what that provision is there for, and it is a fairly limited provision and doesn't apply to employment-based digital replication, which is what we expect to be the most common form of digital replication going forward. So hope that answers that question. Let's see, next. As a puppeteer, I'm concerned about how SAG-AFTRA rights are being reduced to image and voice. Oftentimes, a puppeteer's job is movement-based, and the performer is unseen and unheard. This contract continues to create language that excludes the work of union members who are performing creatures, puppets, and reference work, which often requires union members to be both first team and second team, principal scene partners, and crew members. How can the union be inclusive of this work with this new contract? I might have some thoughts on that, but Ray, would you mind taking that in the first instance, and then I'll come back and pop in after?
Sure. I think the most important thing to say in response to this question is that puppeteers are explicitly covered by the language of the agreement. So there is no inference that is going to be drawn from provisions governing name and likeness that can be used to argue that puppeteers' coverage is reduced or impacted in any way. There is explicit language that covers them, and that language has not changed in this agreement. In areas where we have covered name and likeness, we have not covered name and likeness to the exclusion of any other type of work. The one area where we know this concern exists is in the language on performance capture, where there was a exclusion included for motion capture. And if Duncan didn't mention it, I'll say it. We did not want that exclusion. We do not want that exclusion. We did feel that we needed to accept the breakthrough of acknowledging coverage for performance capture at all, because there was no reference to it at all, no acknowledgement on the part of the AMPTP that it was covered work. So we took that breakthrough knowing that we do need to go back and work on the exclusion for motion in particular. So I would say that's how we go about being more inclusive of that work, is by continuing to work to remove and minimize those type of exclusions, which really only exist in that performance capture language. So that's something we're very much aware of moving forward.
Thanks, Ray. That was great. I don't think I have anything to add to that. Next question, generative AI consent question. I understand that inputting Iron Man's chin doesn't necessarily mean the AI will pull exclusively images of Robert Downey Jr., since Iron Man is IP that has existed with multiple likenesses, comic books, cartoons, animation, and also RDJ and live action. However, Walter White has only ever been represented portrayed by Bryan Cranston. So isn't inputting Walter White's eyes ostensibly the same as inputting Bryan Cranston's eyes, but bypasses having to get his consent? So if the AMPTP can use character name instead of performer's name for GAI, how would they ever have to provide consent to the actor? It's a great question. And my response to that is, where the character's name is being used to evade the provisions of that agreement, then we would file claims to challenge that. So I think the example you've used is a perfect example of that, where only one specific performer has ever portrayed a particular character. And it's clear that what they're doing is what you suggested, using Walter White's eyes as a way of bypassing Bryan Cranston's name. Then we would certainly file a claim, and we would arbitrate, in my view, that that attempt to evade the terms of the contract. On the other hand, if you have a character that's been portrayed by many actors over the course of the history of the industry, I'm guessing maybe Romeo and Juliet might be good examples of that, or there are probably other even better examples. Then I think that would probably not be a claim that we would pursue on that front, because it wouldn't be so clear that they were attempting to evade the provision of the agreement by using essentially a pseudonym type reference for the same person. So I think it's a great question, and that's how we would handle that if it comes up in the generative AI universe during the term of the contract. Next. Do the new protections in casting for those with disabilities include invisible workplace disabilities such as ADHD in the state of California? Will performers need to disclose their workplace disability with every audition to receive any protections? I think, and Ray, you'll correct me if I'm mistaken about this, I think that's going to track the interactive process requirements under existing law, both federal and state, which do not require the disclosure of specifics about a disability, but do require the disclosure of what kind of reasonable accommodation is needed. And yes, it would apply to so-called invisible disabilities so long as they qualify as disabilities under the federal and state law definitions that are in place, which definitely can include any type of condition that materially affects a major life function. So there's a whole host of legal definitions and parameters around that, all of which will be applicable as part of the enforcement of that provision. Okay, I'm not seeing Ray jumping in, so I'm assuming that he doesn't disagree with that. Next, casting sites require payment to use their sites, which includes self-tape submissions. Will these fees be removed? Example, EcoCast via Actors Access is a free service, but only through a performer's paid membership. So those subscription services can still remain, but what cannot continue is any requirement that you use them in order to access sites or submit a self-tape or have access to those opportunities. And in addition to that, it cannot be the case that any subscription or payment that you make, that someone might choose to make, gives them preferential treatment in the submission or consideration of their self-tapes or any auditions or anything else that flow from that process. So basically, these provisions prevent that from happening. Again, the existence of a subscription or the existence of supplementary services, like, for example, there may be a subscription in some of these services that allow you to store more materials on their server to make your uploading of things easier or whatever. Those kinds of things may continue to exist, but access to sides, access to submissions, access to work cannot require a fee, and they will have to change their processes if those processes currently require you to pay a fee in order to do that. The effective date of those provisions, assuming the agreement is ratified, will be approximately the 10th of December. So if you haven't seen those provisions, those services change yet, that's why, because the obligation doesn't take effect until after ratification of the agreement. But once that happens, we will definitely want to be notified of any casting services that are being used that don't comply with those limitations, so we can take action to get that changed. Thanks. Let's see. Next question. If a background actor agrees to be digitally scanned, they get paid for one day's work. So if that digital version of them is then used multiple times, do they get paid for each day they would have been used in person, or does that just apply to performers? There's my understanding that background actors are not considered performers in the language of the contract as it stands. Is that correct? But a background actor be paid for every day or scene that their replica is then used in. So the answer to that question is yes. A background actor's digital replica would result in payment for that background actor if it's used in accordance with what would have been needed in terms of engagement of that background actor to do those scenes in person. So if you create a digital replica and then on a subsequent day, they hire other background actors to fill the numbers, but then use your digital replica on top of that, they will need to pay you for that day for the use of your digital replica. It is true that under the contract, background actors are not defined as performers. The term performer is a specifically defined term that doesn't include background actors. Background actors are a separate term of background actors. And so whenever we deal with contract language there, it's really important for us to be sure that we're clear on what applies to performers versus what applies to background actors. But everything I just talked about applies to background actors, and so you are protected in that regard. Next. For members over 65 and collecting their pension, do residuals once again count towards qualifying for health benefits? No, not yet. One of the things we were trying to do in this negotiation is to generate sufficient additional contributions into the health plan so that our trustees could go back and review that change and seek to determine if we could reverse that change. It's called the dollar sessional rule. So this contract doesn't directly cause that to happen, but the gains in the health plan contributions in this contract will put our trustees in a better position to pursue that as a change. Thanks for the question. Next question. I haven't gotten a solid answer on this. Why was does not apply to non-human characters put in the contract language? So is that, I think that's under the generative AI section, isn't it, Ray? Is that what this question is referring to?
No, it's not under the generative AI section. It's earlier in the AI language. And this was put in to acknowledge the fact that there has been basically animation used for this purpose. You know, the example that we were discussing in bargaining was Spider-Man web slinging from building to building, the canyons of, building canyons of New York City, and the fact that, the animation has been used and other means have been used to show Spider-Man doing that other than a performer actually rendering those services.
But I think it is specifically limited to the generative AI section, though. I think it's found in part A of synthetic performer creation in the generative AI section. And the reason I mention that is only to note that it doesn't directly apply to creation of digital replicas or anything like that. So if a digital replica is created that represents a non-human character, that doesn't mean that digital replica isn't covered by the terms of this agreement. To the contrary,
yeah, you're right about
that. Okay. Let's see. Next, I've been scanned twice for a TV show and a big budget feature. In both cases, the language was hidden in a DocuSign contract. These AI trailers are third-party vendors working for the company/studio. How can these vendors be regulated by studios? Movie stars authorizing their digital replica or synthetic double will erase stunt doubles, voice matching, looping, and union actor work. Also, VO actors have not been mentioned in this agreement. How will SAG protect us? Okay, so that's a lot in there. First of all, let me just say that if a studio or streamer hires a third-party vendor to create on their behalf digital replicas of performers for purposes of a project you've been engaged for by the company, that is considered an employment-based digital replica. That's not an independently created digital replica. And the fact that the companies use a vendor or whatever method they choose to use to create that replica for use in that project is going to be governed by the employment-based digital replica language in this contract. And let me also take the moment to note that once a digital replica is created as an employment-based digital replica, it is always considered an employment-based digital replica, even if later on it's licensed to some other studio or some other party with your informed consent. It'll still be covered under that employment-based digital replica language. So how can those companies be regulated by the studios? They're regulated by the studios by virtue of the contracts that the studio enters into with them to create those digital replicas. So after this contract takes effect, if a studio is going to engage a third-party vendor to create, to do scans and create digital replicas of performers under this agreement, the studio is going to have to include in their contract with those companies all of the relevant provisions to make sure that those companies don't do anything in violation of this contract, because the studio or streamer will be on the hook for that if the companies that they engage to do that work violate this agreement. How can this blah, blah, blah. Okay, we've already answered that question. I want to talk about, there's this reference in your question. We already talked about the question of stunt performers, but we haven't really specifically talked about looping, voice matching, etc. And so let's talk about that for a minute. Number one, the synthetic, the generative AI and synthetic fake provisions of this agreement, I think, are going to be very important for the protection of loopers, for example, because it will be something we can use to help make sure that synthetic voices are not created or used to replace loopers. And the way we will do that is, of course, by having notice of any attempt to do that, and then having a right to bargain for compensation or consideration in that event. Again, using the same strategy that I previously described to make sure that the use of synthetics doesn't actually create an economic benefit for the company, therefore taking away the incentive to do that. As far as voice matching goes, I think this is very similar to the stunt concern that we talked about earlier, in the sense that if a principal performer chooses to agree to authorize the use of a digital replica of their voice in place of someone engaged to voice match them, which frankly a principal performer might choose to do because they might prefer that rather than having voice matching done, they might prefer to have their own voice used for that purpose. That's something that, as the union for all parties concerned, we're not really in a place to prohibit, but we certainly can and will, as I've said, use the tools of this contract to fight against any kind of synthetic voices being used for that purpose in the way I just described. And of course, digital replication of performers' voices is covered under all the digital replication sections. So you have the same protections that any other performer would have against the unauthorized use of a digital replica of your voice, and you have the same rights to informed consent and to fair compensation for any use that you do agree to allow. Next question. Are employers allowed to release you from employment if you decline to be scanned? If you've been engaged, the employer is allowed not to use you, just like they're always allowed not to use you. But if you've already been engaged, you will have to be paid. They will not be able to release you from employment and not pay you, if that was the thrust of that question. Next, is it true that scanning can be a prerequisite for hire so long as 48 hours notice is given? For instance, let's see, ND pad needed for exterior scene this Thursday, you will be scanned. And if so, it's not really giving us a choice. It's mandating us to get scanned. So if we feel that we don't want to be scanned, then we are potentially out of work permanently. So it is absolutely true that if the company gives advance notice that there is an intent to do a scan, and the company provides you with informed consent information so that you know precisely what would be done with the digital replica that would be created as a result of that scan, then the company can say, we only want to hire someone who's willing to do that. Just as I mentioned before, they would only, they could say, we're hiring background actors to do a nude scene on this circumstance, and we're only going to hire background actors who are willing to do the nude scene. That is right. And that is correct. And that is what can happen. So I understand your point regarding, whether there's a choice, because obviously the choice is whether you want to accept that as part of the job that's being offered or not. And so that is a right that you have, but it does mean that there probably will be jobs where creation of a digital replica is something that they expect to happen, and that they will hire actors who are willing to do that. Next question. Have you considered having digital duplicates destroyed after completion of the project? So we did. We considered that. Certainly, we had to negotiate provisions that the companies would be willing to agree to. The companies are responsible for constraining the use of any kind of digital replicas, and they are, limited in this contract from any use other than the use in the project for which an employment-based digital replica was obtained without the informed consent of the performer. So any kind of alternative use has to be consented to. And if that's done without your consent, you can file a claim through us and even potentially a lawsuit for damages in the event that were to happen. Let's see. Next question. Doesn't it logically follow that by using artificially created performances, even if that actor is fairly compensated, the overall film/TV making economy shrinks? If that actor was on set, there would be drivers, hair, makeup, PAs, etc. involved in the work that with AI performances would not be required. As a labor union, don't we need to be concerned about how AI might affect the economy of other workers in our industry? Absolutely, we do, and we are concerned about that. And that's something that we've been talking with our sibling unions, IA, Teamsters, and others about for sure. But we also have to recognize that the idea that we have the power to stop the use of AI in this industry is just not accurate in an attempt to secure important protections for our members with respect to AI. And its use and implementation in the industry. We knew that it was not going to be feasible. We were not going to be able to block the use of AI in this industry completely. So I think the provisions that we have put in place actually constrain the use of AI in a substantial way, far greater than, frankly, anyone expected us to be able to achieve. And considering that there are no protections and no limitations on the use of AI in our existing contract, I think it's a huge step forward in protecting not only our own members, but also providing a platform for these other unions to start from in terms of building in protections that help protect crew as well. So this is an ongoing battle. It's one that we're going to have to continue fighting in successive rounds of bargaining. And of course, the Teamsters, the IA, the AFM all have negotiations with the AMPTP coming up in 2024. And we'll be standing beside them and supporting them as they attempt to further advance this cause. Let's see, next question. What's in the contract, right, group ADR and looping, and how will that be moderating for compliance? I already sort of talked about this just a moment ago. I know you probably put this question in before I said that, but just in terms of monitoring for compliance, as far as synthetic fakes being used for purposes of looping, as I mentioned, there's a notice requirement. And of course, with that notice requirement triggers the ability to make information requests and the negotiation that we talked about. And I think we'll also rely, as we always have, on our members to keep us in the loop on things that they hear about or find out about or that they notice, so that we can also investigate those matters. This is a good opportunity for us to also mention that we have been talking with certain AI companies about developing tools that will actually enable us to deploy AI on the other side of this equation to help us identify unauthorized use, to help us identify circumstances where there have been AI-based alterations to something, perhaps either intentionally or unintentionally, making it harder to identify those things as reuses. And so those are areas where we're eager to deploy additional technology to help us fight back in this situation. So hope that helps. Next. Singers, how did the generative AI provisions apply to off-camera principal performers, i.e. singers? If they use a soloist to train an AI to sound like a 60-person choir, what happens? So that's a great question. If first of all, if it's a generative AI system, so if what you're doing is training synthetic voices, then that is the notice and compensation provisions that we talked about. So obviously, if a single soloist is used to train an AI to create 60 separate voices, then we're going to be looking to negotiate compensation that makes that not economically beneficial to the company in terms of how they have to pay for that scenario. In terms of the use of digital replication, where it's a replication of the sound of the voice of the actual singer, all of the same provisions apply in terms of informed consent, in terms of compensation. So if you're replicating a specific performer, then the replication provisions apply. If you're synthesizing fake people, then those negotiation and notice provisions apply, as we sort of talked about. Ray, I don't know if there's anything you want to say more on that topic.
No, I think you covered it.
Okay. Next question. The creation of digital replicas will clearly require increased monitoring and researching claims filed for unauthorized or unreported use. Can you tell us the plan in terms of enforcement, and if there is an intention to use more staff and resources to implement this? Great question. I already touched on part of that in terms of my mention that I just made about working with companies to develop AI tools to help us with the enforcement process. But I do also expect that we will need to engage some additional staff. And after the ratification of this contract, and once we have the provisions locked in, we'll certainly be looking at a budget proposal for our national board's consideration for the next fiscal year that will take into account any kind of increased staff needs that we have for purpose of enforcement. So yes, let's see. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I think that's it. Well, someone asked, please refresh members' understanding about how to vote. Thanks. Sure, of course. So you should have received, or if you haven't, you should receive shortly, a postcard that has a voting pin, and it tells you exactly how to go vote. But in addition to that, of course, you don't even have to wait for your voting pin, or if you lose your postcard, you can look that up on the voting website. I think, and someone on the staff will tell me if I'm incorrect, but I think there's links to the place where you go to vote that you can find on the ratification page at sagaftra.org/contracts2023. And so in addition to getting all of the materials so that you can review the cast an informed vote, you can go there to get access to the voting website and look up your PIN if you need to do that. Okay. On something like a series, how often will informed consent come into play? Will it be per episode, per scene, per season? So that really depends on how the producer decides to structure their process. My expectation is that it will probably be at least per episode, because if you're being engaged just on an episode by episode basis, they're going to want to present you all of your informed consent information at once so that they can be confident that it's been covered. Obviously, there could be changes that happen during the course of production that might require them to come back to you a second time or even more than that to seek additional consent. And I do want to just emphasize that once you've been engaged for the episode, you have the choice of whether to grant that additional consent or not, and that can't affect your engagement or your compensation under that under that contract. So, but that's going to really depend upon the circumstances of the particular production. Next, in terms of AI, what is the line between live action and animation? Is there any way to track if an actor's performance was used but modified by generative AI to be unrecognizable? So, excuse me. I've been talking about this contract so much I'm going to lose my voice. In terms of AI, okay, so what's the difference between live action and animation in terms of AI? Well, certainly any kind, I think in terms of animation, we're mainly focused on the question of voice performers, because if they're doing, animation in a traditional way, or they're using even AI tools to assist in the animation of something that doesn't involve any kind of digital replication of a performer or any kind of creation of a synthetic fake or anything like that, then we're mainly focused on voice acting. And so the rules for digital replication and use of a digital replica of voice are exactly the same, as we mentioned before, whether it's live action or whether it's animation. So employment-based digital replicas are one, and that's all the stuff we've talked about. If they license in and independently create a digital replica to create a voice, then that also will require informed consent, and that'll be subject to the negotiation of compensation over the licensing of that digital replica. So it really kind of all works the same way. The only difference with animation is you don't have the on-camera element. Is there any way to track if an actor's performance was used but modified by generative AI to be unrecognizable? So, I think that goes back to the AI tools that we had talked about. And of course, if they are using an actor's performance and modifying it using generative AI to create a synthetic fake, the company is obligated to notify us if they do that. So either it's a digital replica, in which case they have to follow all the digital replica terms, or they're creating a synthetic fake, in which case they have to give us notice and we have a right to bargain over that. So there really isn't any gap there where they can slide something through between those two provisions. Next. Thank you for all the incredible work on this contract. I'm curious about the limits of the language surrounding AI protections and the item about consent required to create a digital double, except for when the work remains substantially as scripted. What is the definition of substantially? So the definition of, so obviously there's probably going to be some claims that arise over the term substantially, because like any contract language, there is a possibility of some interpretation. But the word substantially in this context means that if there is a minor adjustment that doesn't, affect the content that's been created in the script, a change of a word from a to the, or things like that, that's not going to be, that kind of change isn't going to change that it's substantially scripted. But if a different scene is added, if the thrust of the scene is different, if the actions that you take are different, then those are going to be substantially, those are not going to be substantially as scripted, because those changes will be significant. And so that's really what the substantially scripted language is meant to cover. I do want to note that as it relates to digital alterations, that's also in the context of the traditional sort of capability to edit things or to adjust things by use of editing technology, VFX and CGI. And so those are things that happen now, and those things will continue to be able to happen under that language as well. Next is services for creation of an employment-based digital replica. Time spent creating replicas, work time, if on the same day that the performer performs other work for a producer. Would you mind clarifying this statement? Does this mean that any time spent creating the replica on the same day that the principal performer is physically working for the producer is considered work time? Is it common practice to create replicas on the same day that the performer is physically working, or is this usually done after? What exactly is work time in this context, and how does it differentiate, if at all, from the performer's pro rata, daily salary, or the day performer minimum, or does this work time only apply to the day performer minimum? Ray, do you want to take that?
Sure. So, yes, it does mean that any time spent creating the digital replica on the same day that you're physically working for the producer is considered work time. So if that sends you into overtime, if that, whatever would trigger if you were doing any other type of work flows from this. So it is considered work time. Is it common practice to create digital replicas on the same day that the performer is physically working, or is it usually done after? It's my understanding that the more common practice is to do it on the same day, and that it is the desire of the producers as to, as much as possible, get this work done on the same day that you are doing other in-person services. What exactly is work time in this context, and how does it differentiate at all from pro rata daily salary or day minimum? Work time in this context is the same as work time in every other context. So if you are engaged at an overscale rate and the work that you do to create the digital replica triggers overtime, sends you into another day of work, then your negotiated rate will apply to those services just as it would apply to any other set of services. So it really doesn't differentiate from your pro rata daily salary. Or if you're someone who's working at scale and your scale is the day performer minimum, then work time will be will be paid at that same rate for the creation of a digital replica. So no, work time applies not just to the day performer minimum, but to any circumstance, and includes application of an overscale rate that you've negotiated.
Awesome. Great answer. Thanks, Trey. Next question is, how do we prevent streamers from hiding a series or not promoting it for 80 days and other tactics to avoid paying? So great question. Let me just say, first of all, we have data from last year and even prior years about the amount of programs that would have qualified under this exact structure. And so if we detect that companies are manipulating the timing of releases or doing things like hiding a series, et cetera, then we will be in a position to file grievances over that, and we will challenge that, because we do have reference data so that we can detect if there's a different pattern in the way that that's happening. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. And I do want to also just note, we have a specific audit right under the transparency provisions and the streaming bonus provisions, so that we can have a third-party auditor come in and audit all of that information if we need that, in order to help document what we're talking about. So I think that is something we're well protected against. Next question. What were the areas of AI negotiation that you wish you had been able to improve upon, but had to punt to future negotiations? And can you talk about the process if the contract is not ratified? Is there precedent for this scenario? Well, I think one area in particular that I would have really liked for us to achieve is a union consent right in the area of synthetic performance, for creation of synthetic fakes. That's something that we had in our proposals for a long time. It became clear towards the end of the strike period that the companies just were not going to agree to a union consent provision. We were able, as I've mentioned before, to get some individual consent provisions attached to the synthetic fake situation with those recognizable facial features. What I think we would improve upon and look to improve upon in future negotiations is in that area, probably expanding upon the scope of where an individual consent is required to broaden those limitations a bit, and also to, again, push on the idea of a union consent right with respect to the creation of synthetic fake performers. That may be something that's more feasible to achieve after the companies see what happens over the next 2.5 years with respect to their use of synthetic fakes as opposed to digital replication. I also think there's some things we could improve in digital replication. Some of the examples of that would include building upon the compensation, the minimum compensation structure for the subsequent use of an employment-based digital replica. We would have liked to have a more expansive minimum for that, and also potentially building upon the minimum compensation structure for independently created digital replicas as well. So I think there are a number of things that we would like to build on in the AI section, but I think in the way we negotiated that, we tried to be really strategic about the things that were crucial, and the most crucial element of that was making sure that members had an informed consent right, because that really if you don't have an informed consent right, then you don't even know what it is you're consenting to, and you have no way to evaluate whether you want to do it or don't want to do it, or whether you want to negotiate additional money or above scale for that if you're someone who normally works at scale. So I think that was a big part of that. And of course, I just want to remind everybody, this is a negotiation. This is not, we go in and just say what we want and every wish we have is granted. We had to fight really hard to get what's in this agreement. There is a lot in this agreement these companies did not want to do. So much that was fought for just provision by provision, line by line over the course of this extended period of bargaining and strike. So I do believe that what we have in these AI provisions is the strongest protection that could possibly have been negotiated, given the circumstances that we found ourselves in throughout the course of the strike. As far as the process, if the contract's not ratified, I touched on that a little bit earlier. But to your question, if there's precedent for that scenario, no, I don't believe so. Ray will correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm not aware of any, at least in recent decades, any contract not being ratified after it's been approved by the negotiating committee and the national board. And if that were to happen, then I think all bets are off. We are back to the board and the negotiating committee to decide what our strategy is going forward. But if the reason the contract's not ratified is people aren't happy with the provisions after we bargained very hard over 35 days plus 118 days on strike, I think people should understand that it's not likely that those provisions are going to improve. Those provisions could get worse. And any chance that they would improve would probably be conditioned on an extended period of additional strike time before anything like that could happen. So that's, I think, the reality. And it might not ever happen. So that's important to know. Next question. Why can't the union put a reasonable limit on how long a studio owns and can use our image? Then at the end of that limited time, they would need to renegotiate with the actor, giving us some power over our image back. So I think that's what you actually have. I mean, if you're talking about a project that's been created, I mean, the entire history of this industry, I mean, it has never been the case that in a collaborative work like a movie or a television project or whatever, that any one actor gets a renegotiation right that could stop the continued exploitation of that project. I mean, that's why we have residuals. That's why there's ongoing compensation for that use. But it's not the case that any individual performer gets to veto the going forward of a project based on a renegotiation right for the right to the use of image or likeness in a project. But when we talk about a digital replica, you absolutely have a veto right over the future use of that digital replica under this contract, under these provisions, other than the project in which it is created and for which you have already granted your informed consent. Any subsequent use of that digital replica requires your informed consent. It cannot be done without your informed consent. And so that means in the future, if you don't want it to be used, you can just say no. You have power in that regard. And to the extent that they really want your digital replica to be used, you have a lot of bargaining power to say to them, well, if you really want it, you're going to have to do this, 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 and this. And one of those thises might be pay me double scale, pay me triple scale, whatever it is that you want to negotiate for. You have every right to negotiate for, and you also just have the right to say no. That's what informed consent means. So that is what the contract provides for already. Under the terms we've negotiated. Next question. We know that there is informed consent, which includes details about intended and limited use on the front end. We know there is compensation for proper use or the threat of prosecution for improper use on the back end. But how are members supposed to police/monitor the thousands of episodes, movies, etc., to know that our images are not being used improperly? and it says it's 1 out of 2, but I don't see the 2. So I'm sorry, we'll probably just have to go with that for now. And if there's a second part to this, we'll have to come back to it later. But how are members supposed to police or monitor the episodes movies to know that their images are not being used improperly? So as I mentioned before, we are eager to help develop some AI tools to help us monitor this. Of course, these kinds of issues are not new to us. We have to monitor the use of projects now for purposes of ensuring residuals payments are paid correctly or reuse payments are paid correctly. I mean, note that any project that you've been in, a clip or part of that might be reused. And how is it that that reuse has happened or that you've been paid correctly for it? Through a combination of you finding out about it through your own sources, through friends or family who see it and tell you about it, or things you might see, combined with tools that the union has in place to address things where we can find out about violations, or where another actor in that project finds out about it, and then we look into it to see if anybody else was impacted. So there's a variety of enforcement tools that are out there, but I guess what I would just say is the most important thing is you can't do enforcement unless you have a right to enforce. And that's what this contract really is about, especially as it relates to AI, is establishing the rights so that we can enforce them for you. So that's sort of where that comes from. Okay, this is jumping around. Next question is AI consent allowed to be a stipulation in employment? Meaning, I think this is sort of a similar version of a previous question that was asked, which is, can the company say to you, we need a digital replica for this project, so if you don't consent to it, we're probably going to hire somebody else? Yes, they can say that. If you've already been engaged and now they're asking you for your consent, then in that case, if you refuse to give it, they still have to pay you under your contract. They can't cancel your contract and not pay you because of the fact that they didn't tell you in advance that they wanted a digital replica, or you decline to grant consent to whatever it is they're asking you for. Is there any, next question. Is there any objective reason to believe that voting down this deal would ultimately result in a better deal? In my opinion, no. As a matter of fact, I think that if the AMPTP's reaction to this deal being voted down would be very strongly to not offer better terms in response to that, because I think they would feel that if they did that, that would set a precedent that would encourage other unions to do that. So I think that we would find ourselves in a very hard bargaining situation in the event that this agreement was not ratified. And members who do that should recognize that that could mean that we would have to either accept a worse deal or go back on strike for an extended period of time, and even then perhaps not get a better deal. So that's reality. Next, please explain the distribution fund process, HVOD. I'm assuming that means SVOD. So I think the question is, what's the distribution fund about on streaming? And so the process, I guess, is just to say there is this money that will come into the streaming fund based on what Ray had described earlier when we were going through the presentation. The money that comes into the fund, this fund is a jointly trusteed fund, means that there are trustees appointed by the studios and streamers and trustees appointed by the union. And this fund will be in charge of setting up distribution guidelines to distribute that money to actors who are working in streaming. The exact distribution structure for that is something that's still going to be worked out by those trustees with guidance from our TV Theatrical Standing Committee, which is our negotiating committee. And the intent of that is, number one, those payments would only go to people who are working on made-for SVOD projects on these streaming platforms. And the second intent of that is it would not be going to the same people that are getting the 75% of that bonus part. This would be going to broaden that pool and make sure that other people working in streaming also receive payments that help sustain a career of people working in streaming. And the last thing I would just say is, this is an important new structure that's built. This is a structure, it exists in our sound recordings code, and we have something similar in our commercials contract, but it has never existed in this contract before. But by building the structure, we're putting ourselves in a position in future rounds of bargaining to increase the amount of money that flows through this fund, and thereby help mitigate the impacts that the streaming business model has had on actors in the long term. Okay. Let's see, next question. will the eligibility requirement remain the same at 26,470, or the two-tier requirement come back? Those are both trustee questions for health plan trustees, and no decision has been made about whether the sort of plan 1, plan 2 structure would be brought back. So I can't really say anything at this moment about what might happen in that area, but I will say additional contributions into the health plan give the trustees more flexibility about what can be done with benefit structures. It's not a magic bullet. It doesn't solve every problem, but to the extent that you have additional contributions coming in, it does give you the chance of doing more things. And that's something that I think all of us should be happy about, is the substantial amount of increased benefit plan contributions coming out of this contract. Thanks for the presentation. I had a 12-page audition this week for first call. Casting said that the parts they crossed out, I only actually had to tape 8 pages. Is that legit, or is it a hard cap on only having 8 pages sent? Ray, can you take that one?
Sorry, within reason, yes. I mean, there is an ability to excise portions of the audition material and not count it towards the total page limit. If you find that this is being done in an egregious way that looks abusive, you should absolutely send that to us, because we can intercede with that casting director in those circumstances. But, within reason, they can excise portions.
Okay, next question is, will there be a time limit similar to the current 6-week limit for speaking upgrades to file complaints about our AI usage / upgrades witnessed when a show / film is released? So I think the answer to this is that our normal grievance and arbitration deadlines apply to the AI section. We didn't adopt any special grievance or arbitration deadlines. But bear in mind that those deadlines are driven off of when you knew or reasonably should have known about a violation. So it's not like if they do something that is not known or reasonably knowable to you, that you're on the hook for finding that within a certain time period. So I think that once you find out about something, or once something has been brought to your attention, it's really important, if you think it's a violation, to bring it to the union right away, so that we can make sure we file any grievance or arbitration within the deadlines. But it's not meant to be a gotcha situation, and that's why it's a know or should have known standard. Next, I'm concerned that the AI regulations, while much better than nothing, and thank you, will put too much onus on the actors to negotiate on our own behalf rather than true protection from the union. Will SAG be able to support those individual negotiations in any way? So for employment-based digital replicas, where there is an established minimum, in the sense that the minimum negotiation is the scale for the comparable period of work time, if your digital replica is doing the work instead of you, we definitely will be assisting you if you find that the companies are not complying with that requirement. We can do that by filing grievances. We can even do that during the negotiation process. If you find that they're offering something that you think is not consistent with that standard, you could let us know even at that stage, and we could intervene there. In terms of negotiating for overscale compensation, that's not typically something that we can intervene in, because that's a matter of negotiation between the performer and the producer. But if you have any doubts, you have any questions, or you have any concerns, you should always reach out to us, and we always do everything we can to help support you in your effort to negotiate above scale terms, because we would love for everyone to be working at the maximum possible compensation that they can negotiate. Let's see. Next, in regards to AI, how will companies calculate the time that it would have taken a physical actor to do the work that has been achieved with an AI digital replica, so that it's a fair calculation? So the companies are responsible for carrying out that calculation and being able to justify that calculation. If you or we think that what they've done is unreasonable, doesn't accurately reflect the scope of work that the digital replica has engaged in comparison to a human performer, then we can challenge that either informally or by filing a grievance and arbitration, and ultimately have it adjudicated by a neutral third-party arbitrator. So that's the method for testing and challenging if we think that they haven't done that fair calculation. Ray, I don't know if you were seeing, I think you're seeing the questions. Can you take the next one regarding the drop pickup provisions?
My question list is slow, so that's not the question I'm seeing.
Okay, it's the next question is, I'll just read it then. It appears that the drop pickup provision of
I
consecutive.
see it now.
See it now? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, that the drop pickup provision of consecutive employment for daily and weekly performers may result in decreased compensation. It moved again. In decreased compensation compared to previous position, was that decrease in compensation factored into the contract valuation? If so, how much compensation was lost due to these provision changes? If not, by what projected amount does that reduce the value of the contract? Certainly, we were aware of the fact that that could lead to circumstances where intervening days would have been paid for previously and are not paid for now. I would have to defer to our economist if he's available or any of his staff is available into how this worked in the valuation. I see David there.
Yeah. So, you said it right, Ray. This could lead in certain scenarios to lower compensation, but we did not value it as a direct money item in the valuation.
Okay.
Is that it for this one?
Yes, I think that's it. The answer is
just making sure.
that was not valued as a loss.
Got it. Okay. Next question is, meeting with AMPTP every 6 months is nice. But what is our bargaining chip to improve things for us? Why isn't there a sunset clause? So a sunset clause on, I guess the question I would ask is, a sunset clause on what? On all the AI protections? Because I don't see how it would be beneficial for us to sunset a whole bunch of limitations on them. Because if you sunset it, what it goes back to is a blank page, and now we have to bargain all of this stuff all over again, when what we actually want to be doing is bargaining improvements to this stuff. So I do not see any strategic benefit to putting a sunset clause on the AI provisions from a union point of view. I can see why the employers might want to do that. I do not see any reason why we would want to do that. As far as the meetings with the AMPTP every 6 months, I mean, I think that is really important, because it is an opportunity for us to really question them and to gain insight into what is happening, particularly with generative AI during the term of this contract, which we will use to help us prepare for the next round of bargaining, and make sure that the proposals that we have are really addressing where the industry is trending and what kinds of things are happening that might impact our members. So I just don't think we should underestimate the value of having the right to have those meetings, and that's why we don't have a sunset clause in the AI provisions. And I'm assuming that's what you were referring to, what the provisions you were referring to. The next question is, if the producers change the dialogue and our lip movement to sync with the change in dialogue that was spoken on set with AI, do we get paid? Sorry, that question twisted me around. If the producers change the dialogue and our lip movement to sync with the change in dialogue that was spoken on set with AI, do we get paid? Do you understand that question, Ray?
I think I understand it to be referring to what you referred to previously, Duncan, in the flawless style of dubbing, where the mouth flaps are adjusted to account for the foreign video speaking. So, and go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, if that is the question, the answer is no. There's not additional compensation for that. That's inclusive in the compensation you've negotiated for your work. And as a side note, Ray, if I would love for us to call it lip movements or something like that, because mouth flaps just sounds disgusting. So hopefully we can get rid of that term. I don't know why. Maybe it's just me. Okay, next question is, if mocap and reference capture are not considered performance capture, could you please give examples of what is considered performance capture? And yeah, there is a definition of performance capture that includes the creation of a performance using performance capture technology that includes tracking of facial and body movements to create a performance that's directed by a director or including a second unit director. And so I think, there is a definition there that definition encompasses the concept of performance. What we have to challenge in the motion capture definition is making sure that it's clear that the concept of performance should be interpreted broadly. And the fact that something is what we might consider, a motion performer or a creature performer, those are also performances that are covered by that performance capture language. And we may have to do some grieving and arbitrating of that language. And I think we will want to clarify and narrow that in future rounds of bargaining. But like Ray said earlier, I really believe that locking this coverage in after 20 years of trying to achieve it unsuccessfully was crucial. And like everything in collective bargaining, it gives us the chance to then improve it incrementally in subsequent negotiations. And so that's the strategy. Obviously, we'll have to take on consecutive employment drops and pickups also. But it is a better battle to be fighting over those things than to be fighting over the question of whether performance capture is even covered under this contract or not, from my perspective. I do want to just note that we're about 15 minutes out from the end of this webinar, and we're not going to be able to extend this one because we have another in-person informational meeting that's going to be happening. So this webinar is going to end roughly on time, but I do want to note that we will have an additional live streamed in-person meeting on Monday of next week, and you'll be able to find additional webinar opportunities, et cetera, through our website, and we'll send out notice about them through email as well. I just say that because I see we've got about over 100 questions remaining, and I know we're not going to be able to answer all of them in the next 15 minutes. So next question, let's see. Will allowing the scans to be a condition of employment for principal actors eliminate photo doubles, since the actor's digital double replica can be used instead? Ray, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I don't think so, because photo doubles are often used in circumstances where, for example, this is a photo double as opposed to a body double. You know what? I might have to think about this a little further. Check the photo doubles provisions. I don't think so, but I'd want to think about this more before I responded.
Okay, we'll put it on our list for a future session as well then. Next question is, what if I work on a streaming show that doesn't reach that streaming participation bonus? Am I still entitled to receive residuals if I work on multiple episodes on a streaming service that is ad-based subscription tiers? The answer to that is yes, you are still entitled to receive residuals. When you say work on that, if you work on that in a capacity where you would have been entitled to receive residuals, you will still be entitled to receive residuals. The streaming bonus structure is entirely a supplemental residual. Nothing about it took anything away from the existing residual structure. And in fact, one of the things that I think people maybe aren't noticing enough, and I want to kind of hype it a little bit, is the fact that there are really significant increases in residuals in this contract, aside from the streaming bonus, that are going to generate many tens of millions of dollars into performer pockets for streaming, for AVOD, et cetera. And so I think that's really important to recognize. And of course, as I mentioned, the fund concept is intended to make sure that there is some distribution of streaming bonus money outside of those shows that qualify as the triggering shows for the streaming bonus money. So in all of those different ways, you will continue to receive residuals, and those residuals will be increased and expanded. Next question. Can a casting notice require that you must have another person read the other character's lines with you? Good question. I may have to turn to Ray to answer this question as well. I know for dancers, there's a specific prohibition on anything other than solo auditions or solo self tapes. But Ray, I'm not 100% sure about the answer to this. Do you know the answer to this?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing that would prohibit them from giving you audition material that has another character in it where you might want to find a reader to work with you to do that audition. However, there's also nothing that would prohibit you from, using the apps that exist to replace readers where a line gets read back to you by the app, or pre-recording yourself, reading the line, and then responding to that. There are various techniques that performers have developed to work around the need for a reader if they can't find one. So there's nothing that prohibits that. You would be able to do that, if that were the circumstance, or you can choose to find a reader in the manner that people also do very commonly.
Thanks, Trey. The next question says, how do the new AI provisions factor into usage and new technologies like the Apple Vision Pro, which presumably would be leveraged by Streamer, Apple TV, et cetera? So the AI provisions really function on the production side of this equation more so than on the exhibition side of the equation. And so obviously there may be attempts to, obviously the Apple Vision Pro might lend itself to more content that is designed for the sort of audience of one. But at this point, the AI provisions we're concerned about all have to do with the generation and creation of content using AI technology, whether for digital replication or for the creation of synthetic fakes. And so I don't think we see the exhibition technology as really driving that in the same way that the production technology is. And of course, in terms of any widespread impact of the Apple Vision Pro, it's quite possible that the price point on that's going to need to come down before that will be something that will have a widespread impact. Next question is, how do you respond to detractors who say building upon these AI gains in the next contract won't matter because AI is evolving so fast, we will already be too far behind? I guess my response to that would be, number one, we should all be very proud of the fact that we are ahead of the curve on AI. We started working on this several years ago. We were among the first to really recognize the potential implications of AI in this industry. We ran panels about this at CES last January before anybody was really talking about all of this and before the impact of generative AI was becoming more of a concern. And so I think that the provisions that we've negotiated are actually very forward-thinking. They are based on principles that will be applicable regardless of evolution in technology, including the informed consent principle, the fair compensation principle. And I think it's also important to know that the provisions that we have negotiated provide us, I think, substantial protection that will protect our members during this term of this contract. And as we see how the industry is evolving, we will be in a position, starting even sooner than 2.5 years, because our W&W process will start before that, to negotiate enhancements to this provision. So yes, AI is moving rapidly. Yes, we have to keep our eyes on that and be aware of that. But we will be back and negotiating this sooner than it feels like. And I do think the protections we've got in place now will keep us in good stead until that time, and frankly, probably quite a ways beyond that time. The other thing I'll just note is while AI has been growing rapidly and evolving rapidly, I think some of the predictions of how fast things will occur have been overstated. And in fact, even in one of our panels back in January, there was a panelist who talked about how fast AI would be deployed in the industry. And that panelist's predictions were wildly off in terms of the pace of that. So I don't want that to send some kind of signal that we're not concerned about the pace of evolution of AI, because obviously we are. But I think what we've set up here will put us in good stead. And having the opportunity to take into account what happens over the next 2.5 years will be really important in our next round of bargaining on these issues. Next question. Can you say more about what the term substantially as scripted, performed, or recorded covers? What are the limitations? When is substance exceeded? Also, what qualifies or doesn't qualify as reasonably specific description of intended use? We already talked about the substantially as scripted part of that, so I'm going to assume this question was put in before we gave that answer. So maybe we'll focus on the what qualifies or doesn't qualify as reasonably specific descriptions of intended use. We did talk about some specific examples of that during the course of negotiation. Ultimately, that language was agreed to because, reasonably specific is actually, it's a legal term that can be, enforced and challenged because it's an objective standard. It's measured by a reasonable person's view of what information would be necessary to feel like they have the specific details that give them the ability to either say yes or no to the consent request that has been presented to them. And while there will be some gray area probably where claims will have to be pursued over that and furthering the specific nuance of that definition in this contract, our lawyers and our legal counsel felt that that was a objectively enforceable standard and one that we are good with. So I think, for some practical examples of that, that means that something that says, I hereby consent to the use of my digital replica to replace me in scenes throughout this project, that's not reasonably specific. On the other hand, a person says, I hereby consent to the use of my digital replica to replace me in the scene on the dock that where I'm getting into a canoe and rowing out into the lake. That would be sufficiently specific. And so there will be a need for the producers to really identify the specific uses that they intend to make of digital replicas so they can secure your consent to that. And there probably will be, especially in the early stages where people are getting used to how to use it. So we'll probably have to come back to you to seek additional consent for things that they didn't anticipate or that they weren't able to describe specifically enough to meet that standard. So hopefully that helps. The next question is regarding consultation clauses. Are there any stronger protections for the performer, i.e., in currently existing contracts, there's a consultation clause, but the verbiage states producers have the final say. How is this different in the new contract? So the only consultation that I am aware of that we're talking about in this contract is the hair and makeup consultation. I don't know, Ray, is there a different consultation provision I'm not thinking of that might be being referred to here?
Maybe the consultation, the wigging and paint down consultation with the union.
Okay.
That's the only other one I can think of.
Yeah, in both of those cases, there's a reason that it's a consultation. So in the case of hair and makeup, obviously what we're looking to do is have the hair and makeup team talk to the performer so that the performer can be confident that they have the skill set needed to take care of their hair and makeup issues, and also so that the hair and makeup team can make sure that they're properly prepared. There is an agreement that in the event that that doesn't result in the and there being properly qualified hair and makeup personnel on set, that the producer will have to reimburse the performer for the cost of any hair or makeup services that they have to procure, independently of the producer. As far as consultation on the stunt doubling issues, the whole point of that is to have the producer come to the union and get guidance and information about how to find stunt performers who can double the principal performer without having to use wigging or paint down. So the union isn't going to take responsibility for the casting process for stunts. That's not a union function, that's an employer function. So consultation is the appropriate language there, just like it is in the case of the hair and makeup pieces. There may be other times where consultation wouldn't be the right way to go, but in these cases, I think it is. Let's see. Next question. Digital replicas are not needed for one's likeness to be manipulated. Where did this language come from? So digital replicas are not needed for one's likeness to be manipulated. Well, that's certainly true. I mean, traditionally, people's likeness has been manipulated in certain ways by traditional editing techniques. Obviously, performance capture has existed for a long time, and that's a way of creating a performance that doesn't follow along with a person's likeness necessarily. But what we're talking about in this contract is in the context of AI is really the replication of actors. And you can call that a digital double, you can call it a digital replica. Those mean the same thing. And our purpose in regulating that is that is something that is actually happening. That is something that has happened and continues to happen and uses AI technology and can impact performers' rights to control their image and likeness, and also to can impact employment patterns. And so that's something that was really important for us to address in this contract, is the issue of digital replication or digital doubles. So that's where that came from. Next, you have mentioned that there is a requirement for producers to inform and negotiate terms with SAG-AFTRA whenever a synthetic performer is utilized, even if there are no distinct recognizable facial features. That's right. And the strategy to prevent displacement of voiceover, looping, creature, puppeteers, motion capture, and other performers is to make such use prohibitively expensive for them. I'm not sure I would say prohibitively expensive, but not economically advantageous is how I would describe that. Could you please elaborate on this? Where would the money go when you negotiate these terms with producers, and how do we intend to enforce compliance on provisions like this? So where would the money go? I mean, that's a great question, because obviously there would not be a specific performer that it would be attributable to. Normally, if we had a claim or a grievance, it's for a performer or a group of performers, and you know who they are, and you can just provide the money to them. And one thing I want to assure everybody of is a negotiation like that would not result in money coming to the union. That's not something that's consistent with federal law, and that's something that would not happen. In grievances we've had in the past where there have been unidentifiable groups of performers, typically what we've done with those funds is ultimately provide them to entities like the SAG-AFTRA Foundation to help fund emergency assistance programs and things like that for our members. So my expectation is that might be, there's no decision that's been made, but that's a likely place where funds resulting from those kinds of negotiations would go. And how do we intend to enforce compliance on provisions like this? Exactly the same way we enforce compliance on all of our other provisions. We have a very qualified team of contract enforcement specialists in the contracts department and in our legal department. And of course, as I mentioned, we have the rights under the contract to demand information as part of the negotiation process that we can use to help further our contract enforcement efforts. So I think all of those would be answers to that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted, if I could, to jump back in on the photo double question.
Oh, great.
Been checking in with Stephanie Perry, our head of background, about that. And our take is the photo doubles are unlikely to be replaced by AI. The producers want photo doubles often to be able to memorize and run through lines. And we did actually negotiate extra compensation for that in this negotiation. And for that reason, we think it's relatively unlikely that they'll be replaced by digital replicas.
Great, thanks for that supplement, Ray. So I think we've just got time for one more question because we're over time now. So this will be the last one for this session anyway. If there are no minimum numbers of SAG actors required in projects by producers, could SAG consider making membership more enticing to non-union actors, thereby increasing union bargaining power by things such as making health benefits more affordable? If affordability is an issue, then perhaps increase dues for A-list millionaire actors to cover costs. So as to that question, there are no minimum numbers of SAG actors required in projects by producers, period. That is true. And of course, we definitely want membership in SAG-AFTRA to be enticing to any professional performer, because having professional performers as part of this union does increase our leverage. And I think that was amply demonstrated by the strike, in that pretty much every professional performer was unavailable to these companies, and they couldn't go forward with production as a result of that. So health benefits being more affordable would definitely be something that we would love to do. Obviously, that is driven by contributions into the health plan that come from employers. It is not legally permitted for anyone other than employers to make contributions to the health plan other than the form of premium payments. So the dues increase concept that you mentioned really wouldn't apply to our health plan, but certainly, I think everyone is aware there was a public statement made by certain of our members about the idea of increasing the dues cap further, so that there would be more dues contributions from higher earning actors. And that's certainly something that the board can consider And how that would be used would not be to fund anything in the SAG-AFTRA health plan, but perhaps to take other steps or put other programs in place to help make healthcare or other services more affordable for actors who don't qualify for those benefits. So that's definitely something that can be considered, but it's really outside the ambit of what's going to happen in this negotiation or in this contract ratification. So with that in mind, I think we've reached the end of our time for the Q&A today. Thanks everyone so much for being here. I want to remind everybody that there's information available at sagaftra.org/contracts2023, including new FAQ answers on artificial intelligence. We have an AI explainer there as well. And of course, the summary of the agreement and other materials are all available at that link, including how you can access voting and cast your vote once you've felt that you've informed yourself sufficiently about what's in the contract. We will have plenty of additional opportunities for people to get more information in the form of webinars, in the form of other types of interactions online and in person. So please keep an eye on your email and an eye on sagaftra.org/contracts2023 to find out about that. If you have a question we didn't get to today, and it's the shortest list of questions we didn't get to, but I know there's a bunch in there. So if you do and you want to get that answered in writing, you can simply send that question to tvtheatrical2023@sagaftra.org as an email, and then one of our staff team will respond to you with an answer to your question. So thanks again, everyone, for being here, and we look forward to seeing you at an upcoming info session. Everyone have a great Saturday. Thanks.